Chapter 226: Rise of the Red Baron. Fielding dedicated fighter aircraft was not exactly something anyone had planned for, other than Germany, that is. It was because of this that the Germans pretty much established air supremacy around their own borders. Opting to ensure their planes detected enemy movements and coordinated attacks with other assets on the ground, such as tanks and armored vehicles, they employed a form of combined arms tactics that the world had not yet truly begun to understand. The way it normally worked was that German planes acted as either reconnaissance or ground attack craft. They would spot enemy movements and send their positions back to intelligence over the radio. Meanwhile, a strike would be coordinated on the enemy position in conjunction with artillery, bombers, and any armored reconnaissance assets hiding behind enemy lines that were in a position to strike. The result of this was rather devastating for the French and British troops that dared to attack Germany's borders. The Germans did not shy away from the opportunity to utilize such tactics in Luxembourg, where the battle lines had advanced after France violated the unarmed neutral Grand Duchy's sovereignty without provocation or notice. Leon found out rather quickly that escaping the eyes of German pilots in the skies was the fevered dream of a madman. Because of this, both the French and British began investing in air power and fighter planes that could compete with the He-51s employed in substantial numbers by the German army. Drastic measures were needed to combat German air supremacy. Because of this, France basically strapped a machine gun onto the top of the Nieuport 10, allowing it to be fired via a serpentine lever by the pilot. It was not exactly what one would call an original or well-thought-out design, but quite honestly, it was more or less the same thing they did at the start of the war in Bruno's past life. There were obvious problems with this design, and to put it simply, it was inferior in every conceivable way to what the Germans were fielding. From the French perspective, it was better than not contending for the skies at all, and instead having all their reconnaissance planes either shot down or forced to flee the moment they spotted German fighters in the distance. Because of this and their newly retrofitted fighter planes, the French boldly decided to contest Germany over their own airspace, or at least they would have if Germany had not mustered a force of its own to prevent them from reaching the border. Frankly speaking, Bruno had gone overboard with preparations for the war. The border defenses were completely impenetrable by the enemy, and this included the World War II-era anti-aircraft weaponry they were fielding. The 2-centimeter flak guns alone were more than enough to obliterate every single plane the French tried to use to cross German borders. But if the 3.7 cm flak guns were considered overkill, then the 8.8 cm flak guns were just plain sadistic. Though the German flak units had little to do, the German army saw fit to actually fight an aerial battle with the French at the first given opportunity, rather than simply sit back and shoot them out of the sky with the tens of thousands of flak guns along the German border. Because of this, famous pilots of the era, such as Manfred von Richthofen, were up in the sky, speeding towards their opponents at breakneck speeds, or at least relatively speaking. The French pilots were naturally intimidated. Those who had survived previous engagements with the Luftstreitkräfte craft knew all too well what they were up against. Though they were promised by their superiors that these new fighters were more than capable of shooting the German planes out of the sky, those with more brains than bravery understood that the German machine guns were hidden and not mounted awkwardly on top of their planes like their own. Hence, French pilots with some form of intelligence performed the sign of the cross as they flew headfirst into potential death. As for Manfred von Richthofen, he had already shot down 12 enemy aircraft, even if they were fighters without the means to combat him in a fair engagement. Despite this, he was far from overconfident. Intelligence reported that the French had equipped weapons onto their planes in an attempt to equalize the playing field, and because of this, he took the threat very seriously. That level of respect instantly flew out the window the moment he opened fire on a French plane and its canvas and wooden structure lit up like the 4th of July. He was shooting 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser incendiary rounds. They were not large enough to explode, but they did ignite upon impact, even riddling the canvas fuselage and wooden frame with more than a dozen bullets would turn the entire plane into a bonfire. Meanwhile, the 8x50 mmR Lebel rounds fired from the Maxim guns mounted on the French planes were standard-issue bullets, without any armor-piercing or incendiary capabilities. Because of this, the bullets, while fully capable of punching through the aluminum fuselages of the He-51s the Germans fielded, had no chance against the modifications Bruno made to their overall design. Bruno had more or less learned from his past life. Not only did he increase the overall power of the He-51's engine, but he also gave it 2 additional upgrades to make it comparable to its rivals from his past life. One was an armored seat/cockpit. The other was a total of 4 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser MG-17 machine guns. This meant that the He-51s the Germans utilized in this life protected the pilots from the weapons of the era unless, of course, they were unlucky enough to get domed in the head, while also providing a whopping 4,800 rounds per minute fire rate across their 4 guns if fired simultaneously. In other words, when compared to the singular Maxim water-cooled heavy machine gun mounted awkwardly on top of the French Nieuport 10 wood and canvas biplanes, the German fighters could ignite them aflame with a single burst while remaining completely unfazed by their shots, moving on to the next target and taking them out before they could respond. Needless to say, exceptional pilots like the Red Baron had more than doubled their total kill count thus far into the war within this single battle. Chapter 227: Damnation in Exchange for Salvation. Greece found itself in a rather unique position following the Balkan Wars. Their territory had more than doubled, and they initially had an alliance with Serbia in regards to joining together should one or the other come under attack by a third party. This treaty was made in reference to Bulgaria even if it had not outright stated it. But the Ottomans soon began to conflict with the Greeks over the Aegean Islands. Naturally, Greece wanted to respond with war, but Serbia had declined. Having had their forces exhausted by the Balkan Wars and suffering from threats on both sides by Bulgaria and Albania alike, Serbia asked Greece to settle the dispute peacefully, which, of course, left a sour taste in the mouths of the Greeks. Then came the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the declaration of war by Austro-Hungary, which plunged the world into a state of total war. Having been previously chided by the Serbians when they initially asked for their help with the Ottomans, the Greeks responded likewise when it came to the joint invasion of Serbia by the imperial powers. Instead, choosing to remain entirely neutral, that is, of course, if Bulgaria made a move, as only an idiot would believe that they would take their defeat in the Second Balkan War and the loss of significant territory lying down. This was initially the case, however. As the war continued to progress with repeated Allied losses, many independent nations began to believe that it would soon be over, with a complete and total imperial powers domination. Greece was not an exception to this idealism towards the war. The Ottomans had joined the Allied powers, and this was Greece's opportunity to settle grudges held since 1453, or perhaps even longer. If it was damn near certain that the imperial powers would win, then what was stopping them from joining now and contributing just enough to regain Constantinople and other historically European and Greek territories? Logically speaking, this reasoning was quite sound. The problem, of course, being the Balkans would be a region of the world that would forever engage in absolute fuckery of the highest level. If the Greeks suddenly announced an entry into the war on behalf of the imperial powers, then Bulgaria would soon join the Allies. Bruno was no doubt conflicted about this matter. On the one hand, he felt one of his minor regrets from how World War I turned out, and the years of global chaos which followed its conclusion, was that the Greeks unfortunately did not regain control over St. Constantine's holy city, as well as the lands surrounding it, and in doing so, blocking off the Islamic world from Europe altogether. On the other hand, Bruno was quite fond of Bulgaria, at least from a historical perspective. They were the only nation during the Great War that was remotely capable of pulling its own weight within the Central Powers and was, in all honesty, Germany's only capable ally during the conflict. At the same time, the Bulgarians bet the house on Germany again 20 years later during the Second World War, proving once again to be the only nation in the Axis powers that was remotely capable of holding their own in battle. Thus it came as a surprise when the King of Greece announced he was joining the imperial powers and would be declaring war on all of their adversaries, thus being the first Balkan nation other than Serbia and Montenegro to join the Great War in this new timeline. Bruno honestly didn't know how to react. He would effectively have to carry the Hellenic army to victory. After spending years making sure the Austro-Hungarian and Russian leadership understood the critical flaws of their militaries, and as a result indirectly making them better in this life, it was safe to say that the imperial powers had the three most powerful armies in the world among their ranks. But the addition of Greece complicated things for Bruno. The likelihood was that Bulgaria would now declare war on behalf of the Allies, and while that wasn't the end of the world as they were a minor power, one which his alliance could easily overcome. It was difficult for Bruno to have a desire to do so. He respected loyalty and competence above all else in life. And Bulgaria had proven to be a loyal and competent ally when Germany had no others they could rely upon in his past life. At the same time, Bruno desired to retake all of the Turkish-occupied European lands for the Europeans. And hence he genuinely did not know how to feel about this matter as he read about it over a telegram sent to him. At the very least, Serbia was now being pincered on both sides, and Greece stood in the way of the Ottomans sending supplies to Serbia through Montenegro. Heinrich and Erich noticed that Bruno was acting strangely as he drank his morning coffee from a metal cup designed for field usage. The two men were sitting across from him, while the man read the paper. As a result, Heinrich quickly made a comment of his own with a jestful tone. "Let me guess, your wife has been granted another order of chivalry." Bruno placed his paper down on the table and shifted his gaze towards his old friend. It was nothing but stern, as was his voice when he posed a question that caused both Heinrich and Erich to feel goosebumps rapidly spread across their entire body. "In what world do I appear to be the type of man who is remotely unraveled by my woman's, nay, my beloved wife's success in her charitable endeavors? Am I seriously so reprehensible in character to the both of you that my wife being awarded for her virtuous efforts would be a matter of grave concern to me? Obviously, I'm conflicted over the matter of Greece officially entering our alliance. I seriously wonder why the two of you are my closest friends if you genuinely believe I am such a shallow and petty man. No, if Heidi was deemed by Her Majesty Kaiserin Augusta Victoria to be worthy of such an honor, it would be among the happiest days of my life, just behind my marriage and the birth of my children." Erich and Heinrich bowed their heads in remorse. Sometimes they forgot how seriously Bruno took his family and their well-being. But Erich had to ask the question that was on both of their minds. "I'm sorry, but I'm confused. You have been awarded all the honors Russia can give for your volunteer service to the House of Romanov. Even now the Kaiser grants you the unprecedented privilege of the rank of General Feldmarschall at the age of 34 for your contributions to the German Reich, and continues to award you for your efforts on the battlefield. And yet you just said you rank all of those below your wedding, the birth of your children, and the potential of your wife having 1/100th of your recognition for success. Can you explain to me why this is the case?" Heinrich remained silent. He more or less understood Bruno's feelings on the matter. Sure, he was unmarried, but he had an adopted daughter he had raised to adulthood who was the pride and joy of his life, far more so than the medals on his chest, even if he didn't really realize she was already an adult. But Erich? The man had become a full-fledged sociopath after the horrors he endured in Russia. He lived for one reason, violence. And if there was a second reason, it was the recognition of his accomplishments in that regard. Bruno, however, had what he had always desired over the course of 2 lives. And because of this, he did not even get mad at his friends for not fully understanding his position. Rather, there was a strange and complicated emotion on his face as he expressed his equally convoluted thoughts. Allow me to put it this way. Everything I have ever done in my life, no matter what that may be, since I was but a small child, was for the purpose of family, folk, fatherland, Kaiser, and God. And make no mistake, the sense of priority comes in that order. My family is the single most important thing in my life. My children and their future is what I fight for. My wife's accomplishments in regards to charity completely overshadow my own bloody regalia. I am a mass murderer, and by the strictest of definitions, I am to be condemned as a war criminal. I toil, sweat, cry, bleed, and spill the blood of others so that my wife, sons, and daughters may live a life free from such worries. At one point in my life, earning an Iron Cross, or a poor Lomerite, would have been the greatest honor you could have given me. But what is the point of a metal forged from iron when it is inherently soaked in blood? Comparatively, should my wife be awarded the Order of Louise, It would have meant that her efforts to save lives and help the helpless would have matched my own efforts to reap as many souls. Her salvation, when compared to my own damnation, is worthy enough of a cause to celebrate among the happiest moments of my life, is it not? Especially when one considers where she has come from, to where she is now. It was hard to refute Bruno's words when he spoke with such passion and reflection. Because of this, both Heinrich and Erich remained utterly silent as the man picked back up both his cup of coffee and his newspaper, resuming his reading of its lead article with a far more stoic expression than he previously had on his face. Chapter 228. Internally debating the pros and cons of Greece versus Bulgaria. The Greek entry into the war brought many benefits to the imperial powers, but as many drawbacks. The largest benefit was the fact that the Ottomans now found themselves being invaded on two fronts. On their westernmost borders, they were now being attacked by the Hellenic army, whereas from Armenia, the Russians and Austro-Hungarians, along with a small contingent of German troops, pushed through into Anatolia. At the same time, the Hellenic navy began to patrol the Mediterranean alongside the KUK Kriegsmarine, or in other words the Austro-Hungarian navy, giving the imperial powers significantly more firepower to combat British, French, and Ottoman attempts to aid Serbia. This was an asset Germany would not gain with Bulgaria, whose entire navy consisted of a single gunboat and 6 torpedo boats. Whereas the Hellenic navy was by no means a maritime powerhouse, but at the very least they had a decent-sized fleet of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, all of which could be used in conjunction with Austro-Hungarian naval assets to coordinate strikes against Allied shipping and transportation of troops. In addition to these two naval forces could work together with the Russian Baltic Fleet to seize control of the Bosphorus Strait and allow free movement of the Russian naval forces in the region, combining them all into a force capable of challenging the Allies for control over the Mediterranean Sea. While the German Reich had one of the most advanced and powerful navies in the world, its current focus was geared towards ensuring German hegemony over the Baltic, the North Sea, and the English Channel, where they were constantly contested by the British Royal Navy. Because of this, there were few assets they could send to the Mediterranean to aid their allies. This was, of course, Bruno's biggest complaint about the Habsburgs. Their sense of pride as the former Holy Roman Emperors had more or less prevented Austria from unifying with the German Reich. In doing so, Austria prevented Germany from having access to the Mediterranean, which was both economically and strategically significant. After all, the Archduchy of Austria held territory in the Austrian littoral, had ports within the Adriatic Sea, a smaller body of water which fed into the Mediterranean. Had the Archdukes of Austria unified with Germany in 1871 and bowed their heads before the House of Hohenzollern, who had already defeated them a few years prior in 1866, then Germany would have access to critical trade routes and major zones of strategic importance. This also would have allowed the Germans to maintain a far more advanced naval force in the region, as the KUK Kriegsmarine was woefully obsolete and undertrained in comparison to their counterparts in the German Kaiserlich Marine, and that was still the case in Germany's past life. With the introduction of Bruno's inventions and innovations in this life, it was truly a sad state of affairs that a second fleet of submarines and destroyers could not have been built in the Austrian littoral. Ultimately, however, the largest downside of Greece entering the war on behalf of the imperial powers, having perceived almost certain German victory, and wanting to take advantage of that fact to combat the Ottomans and seize disputed territories, was the fact that the Hellenic army was far fewer than the Bulgarian army and much less competent. Because of this, Bruno had to sit for some time and consider what was more important to Germany at the moment: additional bodies in the meat grinder that was trench warfare, or naval assets, of which took significantly more time to build than it did to train a soldier how to shoot a rifle. As much as he personally did not want to admit to it, the fact of the matter was the introduction of the Hellenic fleet onto the German side in this war was a much larger boon, especially since the German army already had such an overwhelming technological advantage over their enemies that it more than made up for the numbers the Bulgarian army would send to aid their cause. Ultimately, it was a sacrifice Bruno would have to make, one he was surely conflicted about, as fighting the Bulgarians despite the loyalty and competence they showed towards Germany in his past life was something that was entirely out of his control. After all, Bruno may be among the highest-ranking military commanders in the German Reich, but he was currently deployed into Serbia, meaning that he had no means of negotiating a peace agreement between Greece and Bulgaria. Nor would Bruno be able to make such a compromise, as the disputed regions between the two nations were lands which he personally felt rightfully belonged to Greece. To hand any of the disputed lands over to Bulgaria based upon the legitimacy of the two nations' claims was simply absurd to Bruno. Epirus, Macedon, Thrace, Ionia, Crete, and Cyprus were Greek lands since time immemorial and had been under Ottoman control for far, far too long. Since the Ottomans had joined the Allies in this timeline, there was no reason these lands should not end up under Greek authority, assuming Bruno was able to succeed in his endeavors of reversing the course of history. And as much as Bruno respected Bulgaria, any compromise would more or less be exchanging one of these rightful Greek claims for another, something Bruno could not agree to in accordance with his conscience. Hence why Bruno ultimately put his paper away and finished his coffee, concluding that history was moving in the right direction, even if it was an unintentional correction made by the butterfly effect. Because of this, he sighed heavily, after speaking at length about how he prioritized the accomplishments of his family above his own, and admitted the truth about why he seemed to unusually lost in thought. If you too must know why I seemed so conflicted, it was because I was internally debating whether or not the King of Greece announcing his entry into the war on behalf of our alliance was ultimately a positive or a negative. Heinrich and Erich looked at one another in silence. After the rather emotional revelation that Bruno cared very little for his personal achievements and was instead focused on the well-being and legacy of his family, they honestly thought that him being so conflicted over what they thought was a relatively small matter seemed out of place. Erich, however, always keen on trying to understand what complex geopolitical maneuvers Bruno was scheming within his own head, was quick to ask why Bruno had thought so long about such a petty topic. "I apologize, but I am a bit confused. Why would such a matter have you acting so distraught? These are mere minor powers seeking to make little territorial advances off of the sweat and blood that we primarily shed in this war. Does it really matter which of these nations side with us, and which don't?" As per usual, Erich revealed why he would always be a field officer and would never make his way into the general staff. His lack of understanding towards grand strategy and geopolitics ensured that, at best, he would command a small group of elite forces into battle. But then again, the man's tenacity and bloodthirsty nature made him perfect for such tasks. Even so, Bruno and Heinrich could not help but shake their heads at their friend, while Bruno simply answered in a way that only further confused Erich. Though it may not seem like it, whether Greece or Bulgaria aligns themselves with the German Reich and the imperial powers has the potential to permanently affect the course of history. But then again, Erich, I believe your abilities are better suited towards leading men into combat than playing chess on a global stage. This was, of course, not intended as an insult, nor was it perceived by Erich in such a manner. As he too believed, he was ill-suited towards leading campaigns. Thus, he simply nodded his head and agreed to Bruno's statement, deciding to ignore the greater implications of Greece entering the war and instead continue to serve in his official capacity. Chapter 229, Confusing the Enemy Without Trying. Bruno came to notice something as the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian armies came together. Something subtle had shifted in the timeline, and it was not exactly all that surprising. To a certain degree, the same rules which applied in his past life still were applicable to this timeline despite its changes. What did this mean? Well, at a very small level, slight changes in uniforms were made due to the nature of the shift in alliances. For example, in Bruno's past life, there were, for the most part, two different steel helmet designs that came to dominate the battlefield during the Great War. If one were aligned with the Central Powers, then the odds were that they adopted the M1916 Stahlhelm, originally created by the German Reich, as their answer to head trauma caused by artillery shrapnel. Or at the very least, they fielded some form of locally produced variation of that design. This had been true for not only Austro-Hungary, but also the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Bulgaria during Bruno's past life. Whereas the Allied powers, except for two exceptions, used the French Adrian helmet more or less. This included Russia to a much smaller degree, as they were very late to the game to adopt a steel helmet as a result of Tsar Nicholas's aesthetic sensibilities. The two exemptions to this general rule of thumb were Great Britain and their infamous MKI helmet. There were various nicknames given to this timeless flat brim design, such as the Brodie helmet or the Tommy helmet, but at the end of the day, it was the same thing. The United States, curiously enough, was the only faction during the war of any partial significance which opted for the British MKI design over the French M1915 Adrian helmet, which the American soldiers affectionately referred to their domestic copies of the MKI as the Doughboy helmet. I mention these distinctions because in this life it was the same way. With Germany adopting the M1916 Stahlhelm much earlier than it otherwise should have, a decade or earlier that is, there were naturally copied designs by its allies who understood the value of steel helmets, as the infamous Iron Division, which Bruno led into Russia, had received far fewer casualties as a result of their unique head protection. The Austro-Hungarians, much as in Bruno's past life, copied the Stahlhelm. It was damn near identical aside from the chin strap used and the placement of the rivets which attached it to the helmet. However, what was most certainly interesting was the fact that the Russians had also adopted their own variation of the Stahlhelm, a direct copy of the German version. The only distinction was the Russian Empire's coat of arms being emblazoned into its center, something that interestingly enough appeared during Bruno's past life among German Freikorps volunteers in the Russian Civil War of 1917–1922, something which Bruno had luckily dealt with much earlier in this life, and thus did not have to fear as a consequence of his pursuit of victory over the Great War. Because of this, there was little distinction in the appearance of the combined army of the imperial powers as they marched south through the Balkans, in particular both Montenegro and Serbia, especially as both Germany and Austro-Hungary had adopted a damn near identical version of Feldgrau for the coloration of their uniforms. The Russian uniforms were only mildly different in this regard, as they were more of an olive drab green than they were a green-gray. Even so, the Stahlhelms, brown leather equipment, and puttees did no favors in distinguishing them from their allies, who shared a similar degree of equipment. Even though the cuts of their uniforms and insignia were wholly distinctive, such things were difficult to spot at a distance. Because of this, if one were gazing from afar, even with binoculars, the massive force of men moving in tandem with one another almost appeared like a force of 1 million German soldiers to the uninitiated, which was a terrifying thought considering how efficiently the Germans had been dealing with their rivals on the global stage. And because of this, when the Serbian provision government heard back from its scouts that somewhere around 1 million German soldiers were advancing into their territory, the leadership instantly began to panic. The reality was that only about 300,000 of those soldiers were actually German soldiers. After the victory at Belgrade and its successful defense, Bruno ordered the Second Army, along with the 11th Army, to invade the Kingdom of Montenegro. Montenegro had remained neutral for the first month of the war. That is, until Bruno smashed half the Serbian Royal Army at the border and obliterated their capital all within a single month. In retaliation, the small Balkan kingdom had quickly declared war on the imperial powers. The reality was that since the start of the war in July, Montenegro had been ferrying troops and supplies into their lands to support Serbia, all under the guise of neutrality. The moment they declared war, however, Bruno was well prepared to counter them, and in doing so split his own forces to do so. This wasn't exactly difficult, with Russian and Austro-Hungarian reinforcements. He was able to spare 2 whole field armies for the Montenegrin campaign, and in doing so, still have roughly 1 million men give or take to combat the Serbian Provisional Army. Normally, it would be easy for a properly trained scout to spot the difference between German troops and those of their allies. The problem was that the Serbian Provisional Army was basically relying on men with minimal training and whatever equipment they could scrounge together. Thus, the idea that the 300,000 men who were using motorized transportation for their troops' equipment and were the only German soldiers within the massive army advancing south into Serbia never even crossed their mind. Instead, the roughly 700,000 men in similar uniforms but marching on foot and carrying their equipment either on their own backs or via horses and pack mules were also assumed to be German soldiers, resulting in an unintentional disruption of Serbian intelligence and Allied intelligence overall. Either way, the Serbian provisional government was now in a state of internal panic and was considering whether to throw in the towel altogether or flee into Montenegro and Albania to continue the war via a combined guerrilla campaign. Especially now that Greece had announced its entry into the war and would be attacking Serbia from the south, while Germany attacked from the north. It was truly a very bad situation to be in. But in all reality, the current situation was much better for the Serbians than they thought, considering that the German soldiers and artillery composed of only a minority of those headed their way. Chapter 230, Order of Louise. It was no exaggeration to say that Heidi's humanitarian efforts had a monumental payoff for the German Reich, its wounded veterans, and their families. Less deaths meant fewer orphans and widows. And those that were created were well taken care of by the financial support that Heidi had put in place for them via her nationwide charity. The result of these selfless acts were widespread and well known, in part because of the influence the von Zehntner family had over the press, but also because good deeds done for their sake alone were a rarity in this world. Altruism was a concept that existed in theory only. It was an idea of what humanity could be, but in reality would never be. Anytime any human ever did something that could be perceived as selfless, there was always some ulterior motive. Vanity, fame, penance, or simply fear of not fulfilling God's will. Every generous act had some selfish motive tied to it, if not driving it entirely. It was simply human nature, and Heidi was no real exception to this. Albeit her reasons for being so charitable weren't to conceal some greater sin, or to simply stroke her own sense of virtue. Two reasons which one might argue were the most reprehensible reasons for committing a good deed. Rather, she was genuinely trying to change from the person she had been into something more ideal. That was the thing about change. It was damn near impossible for someone to change their true nature for the better. It was incredibly easy for someone to break down and corrupted to a level where they could do things once thought to be inconceivable. But changing into something better, or even wholly good, that was an idealistic notion, a hope that fools clung on to, thinking that eventually they might not be the wretch they are now. Could they alter their behavior? Almost certainly, and even then, the difficulty in doing such a thing in regards to self-improvement was seldom easy. However, one's nature was ingrained in a person's body, mind, and soul. Hence the phrase, "a leopard can't change its spots," which was a common idiom in the English language. People seldom really became a better person on an intrinsic level, and it was why pattern recognition was among the greatest survival skills one could possess. To be able to understand someone's past behaviors was the ability to predict their future actions. Most of the time this rang true, but on the rare occasions one might fake it until they make it, and eventually undergo a metamorphosis into an entirely different human being. It was so rare that such shifts in character were the work of myths and legends. Even so, the price one would have to pay in order to undergo such a change was usually immense personal sacrifice and suffering. Perhaps 1 in a billion people were actually capable of transforming into something better. Overall, it was not like Heidi had a starting point among the worst of sinners. No, she was quite a virtuous person from the start. She had a sense of love and loyalty to her family, so much so that it bordered on the extreme. She was a wonderful mother and wife. In addition to this, she had always been kind and ladylike as she was properly raised to be. So much so that even her half-sisters had always envied Heidi for her qualities, which were exemplary of princesses like themselves. Qualities which they were always lacking. But deep down inside, there was a hatred in Heidi's heart that she had been battling constantly to keep from poisoning her soul. This hatred was justifiable and was only towards those who had wronged her in ways that she had only recently in the course of the last few years been able to forgive and move on from. But hatred was an emotion that was insidious and infecting. It was the most powerful human emotion in existence, and once one's soul had been corrupted by its influence, it was damn near impossible to be rid of. It would fester and grow until one acted in a way they otherwise normally wouldn't. Or it would lie dormant, forever a part of them. Perhaps if they had the strength of will, it could be suppressed for years, decades, or perhaps even a lifetime. But it could never be expunged. Not truly. Only in legend could such a saving grace overcome a man, or in this instance a woman, and change her fate for the better. But if Bruno's acts in this life had not been such a miracle to the world and the people within it, then what else could be defined as such? Perhaps had Heidi never met Bruno, never been engaged to him, had a family with him, and come to be influenced by him, she would have died young, or perhaps even been a miserable, hateful witch for her entire life. Yet that was not this timeline nor the life which Heidi lived in it. And because of this, she was finally able to forgive and move on from her childhood suffering and the death of her mother. She was able to change and become someone who genuinely, honestly, sacrificed her time and family's fortune to help the less needy for no reason other than the fact that it was the right thing to do. And because of this, while Bruno was marching into southern Serbia with an army of roughly 1 million men, Heidi had been called to the Kaiser's palace. It was a rare thing for her, personally, to be granted an audience with the German emperor. Every time she and her children had been invited to the imperial palace, it was because of Bruno's influence. This was the first time that Heidi was alone and her presence had been requested. Hence why she was a bit nervous, as she dressed in her most formal attire and styled her hair in a way that was most elegant. She would be turning 33 in October, and yet she was as beautiful and ravishing as a maiden 10 years younger. Without Bruno by her side to scare the wolves away, no doubt there would be several hundred suitors trying to steal the bride from her man. But that was ultimately not the case, as when Heidi stepped foot in the palace, she was surprised to find that it was not the Kaiser himself who had requested his presence, but rather the emperor's wife, Augusta Victoria of Schleswig-Holstein, who was standing next to her daughter, Princess Victoria Louise of Prussia, as well as a variety of other German noble ladies, many of which were queens, grand duchesses, and princesses in their own right. Before Heidi could ask why she was summoned here, the Kaiserin quickly stood up from her seat, prompting all others to do so, and gave Heidi an order, one that she was quick to follow. It is customary to bow when in the presence of an empress. Heidi was all too aware of these customs, but was so blindsided by this strange gathering that she had completely forgotten her manners, quickly bowing her head and performing a proper curtsy as she apologized for her poor manners. "Apologies, Your Highness, I was dumbstruck momentarily. Do forgive my lack of manners. And respect." The Kaiserin looked over at her daughter, who silently smiled and nodded her head, prompting the Empress to sigh before announcing which Heidi was summoned to her home. After careful consideration and discussion with the fellow members of the order, I have deemed it fit to grant you, Heidi von Zehntner, with an Order of Louise, Dame, First Class, as a reward for your exceptional charitable actions towards the Kingdom of Prussia and the German Reich as a whole. After saying this, the Kaiserin walked over to Heidi and pinned the ribbon of the order and its distinctive medal to the left breast of her finely tailored dress. Heidi stared in disbelief, never expecting such an incredible reward for actions she had taken purely as a means of helping the less fortunate during an unfortunate time in human history. She wanted to say something, but stammered in disbelief as tears welled up in her eyes, an act which prompted all the other women to smile at her and comfort the woman who now stood among the most elite order of aristocratic women in the German Reich, an order of chivalry entirely meant for women of noble birth and their charitable deeds. Whether it was becoming a full-fledged princess as a result of being Bruno's wife and the actions he had taken in Russia to earn them such status, or it was the fact she was now being treated as a proper noble lady by legitimate empresses, queens, and princesses, Heidi finally felt as if her questionable heritage was a matter of the past, something which had haunted her for her entire life. Not even Bruno's brother Maximilian could dare to say a word towards Heidi or her parentage, lest he invoke the wrath of the House of Hohenzollern, who now recognized Heidi as a noble lady of the highest virtue. Chapter 231. Run Through the Jungle. The war in Europe was progressing more or less than Bruno had initially expected it to. The front lines had been stalled in the west, as Germany defended its own territory and that of Luxembourg from repeated French invasion. Meanwhile, France was slowly grinding their way through Belgium, a nation which had yet to ask for aid from the German Reich. At the same time, the British finally managed to land forces in France, albeit in the south, who were now marching northwest towards Alsace-Lothringen to aid the French army, who were still trying to break through them. In Isonzo, the Germans and Austro-Hungarians continued to hold the line against the Italians. And in the Balkans, All-out war had broken out with the Serbian Provisional Army being attacked on both sides. But if there was one mostly forgotten front of this war that had been entirely opened up as a result in the shifts in alliances, it would be the fact that the Imperial Japanese Army had begun attacking Allied colonial territories in the East. For example, French Indochina, where the Japanese were getting a taste of modern 20th century combat for the first time since Mukden. The introduction of belt-fed general-purpose machine guns had been a game-changer in the East. By the outbreak of the war, not only had the Japanese finished the development of the prototype, which they showed Bruno years prior, but had also begun to put it into mass production. As a result, the Japanese soldiers currently slogging through the jungles of French Indochina were equipped with far more firepower than the French were prepared to deal with. Echoes of machine guns and bolt-action rifles rattled throughout the heavily wooded areas. French soldiers shouted in their native language. The words were jumbled together in an incoherent mix of various thoughts and commands. But most noticeable were the repeated cursing of the French machine gun crews who were desperately trying to get their Putos machine guns to properly function. The weapon systems ate maybe 5 to 7 rounds maximum before requiring an extensive clearing procedure. Worst yet, some critical components of the firearm were prone to breakage, and when that happened, the weapon was dead in the water, so to speak. Because of this, one particular French machine gun crew kicked their weapon into the mud, as they retreated immediately after their weapon broke down on them. Meanwhile, a Japanese machine gunner, spotting the French flee like roaches exposed to the light, picked up his relatively lightweight weapon and aimed down its sights while shouldering the bracing the stock against his shoulder, firmly holding it tightly while screaming in Japanese and firing at the fleeing French soldiers. The bullets struck the men in the backs as they hit the drenched soil, their bodies and uniforms soiled by the earth as much as their own blood. Meanwhile, the Japanese riflemen chased after the fleeing French with bayonets affixed, ending the lives of the men who were cut down by machine gun fire, but not yet down with a single thrust to their hearts. The Japanese officers in the distance noted how effectively their machine guns were performing on the battlefield, while their own artillery continued to battery the secondary French position, which the retreating soldiers were desperately falling back to. It would appear that the late Emperor's Meiji's fondness in the Germans has proven to have borne exceptional fruit. These Type 45 machine guns have performed flawlessly even in the density of this wretched jungle. I dare say that the French have no real counter to them, and by summer of next year alone, all of Indochina will be in our hands. The officer standing beside the field commander nodded his head while speaking his own thoughts about the matter. Indeed, we have the great Mamushi to thank for this. I hear his accomplishments in the West have been equally fearsome as what he displayed at Port Arthur and Mukden. It would be incredibly unwise to place a wager against the German Reich so long as a man like that is in command of its army. This was a sentiment that was equally shared by the Japanese field commander, who sighed and nodded his head while reminiscing about the battle which he personally witnessed Bruno lead a decade earlier. I have seldom seen a man in such a high position disregard his own life and lead his men into battle from the front lines. I dare say, if he is still foolish enough to engage in such reckless behavior, then he won't be around long enough to make a difference in this war. Utter silence remained between the two men as the echoes of the battlefield remained a constant reminder of the death and destruction that was happening in front of them. Bruno sneezed and wiped his nose as he did so. He could not help but feel that someone, somewhere, was speaking ill of him, or perhaps wishing a horrific fate upon him. After all, he was not the type of man to ever really sneeze outside of sickness, and he was currently in perfect health. Because of this rare and random occurrence, he simply looked over at his two oldest friends before giving them a grim stare. If either of you shits have any ideas about stabbing me in the back, just know I will be taking you with me to the grave if you have the balls to attempt it. Heinrich looked at Bruno as if he was being unnecessarily paranoid, which he was about to voice before Eric interrupted him with his own sick sense of humor. Buried forever together with the General Feldmarschall would be my greatest honor. Heinrich shook his head at Eric's words, while Bruno elicited a rare chuckle, all while shaking his head. Yeah, you would like that, wouldn't you? Is that the reason you are not yet married at your old age, my friend? Maybe I was right all those years ago. Eric immediately froze on the spot, overcome by memories he had otherwise forgotten. Nearly a decade ago, The two of them had set sail to Asia aboard a ship that was captained by Eric's older brother. On board that vessel, Bruno had convinced the captain that Eric was a homosexual, something that during this era was highly frowned upon. Needless to say, there was hell to pay for such a cruel and outright malicious prank. Because of that, as the three men sat in the passenger seats of their cubble wagon while advancing with the rest of the army southward, Eric couldn't help but remind Bruno with an almost murderous glare that he still remembered this insult. You know, I had almost forgotten about this incident, but now that you have returned it to the forefront of my memories, I realized I have never quite forgiven you for angering me in such an unprovoked manner. Bruno chuckled as he heard Eric's threatening words. He knew Eric was an attack hound, one that was liable to attack its own master if not properly reminded of its place in the world. And because of this, Bruno smoked out the window before turning his head around to look at Eric. The gaze that Bruno gave his friend was chilling, while the tone in his voice bordered on the sadistic. You see, that's the difference between you and me, Eric. I don't get angry, I get even, and violence has always been something that I believe in. If you have a problem with me, then we can settle this little grievance of yours, like men, at any time of your choosing. But just be prepared to suffer the consequences of your challenge if you do wish to pursue this matter. Understanding that he had just provoked the only man he had ever known who had more blood on his hands than himself, Eric instantly quelled his thoughts and looked away in a silent act of submission. Something that only caused the sadistic smirk on Bruno's face to grow into an even more wicked sneer. After finishing his cigarette and tossing it out the window, he was quick to reward Eric for settling the matter without bloodshed. All right, so I'll take it this matter is settled then? Yes? Good. As a result, I'll give you something you have wanted for a while now. I am tasking you with commanding the stormtroopers from here on out. You understand what I am saying, yes? Bruno had long since created specialized stormtroopers in anticipation of the war, and Eric had transferred back to the army specifically to participate in such a unit who specialized in trench raiding. Unfortunately, until now he had been on a double secret probation because of his, shall we say, more chaotic tendencies. This probation had him tied to Bruno as his personal adjutant, but now Eric was being sent back to the front lines like he so desperately desired, meaning that Bruno had finally decided to let his mad dog off of his leash. And when he did so, the bodies that Eric and his men would stack up would be enough to make their unit a legend. Chapter 232 Pride is the root of all evil. Eric found himself in his new unit and was quite comfortable with the arrangement. In the Great War of Bruno's past life, stormtroopers were a development much later in the conflict. They were especially small units who specialized in trench raiding, with the ultimate objective of infiltrating the enemy fortifications and forcing an entry for the regular infantry to break through. Development of such tactics led to significant gains by the German army in the months that followed, or at least relatively so, when 300,000 men died for 6 miles of land and 1 million more were wounded in some capacity. Then even a few yards of ground gained was significant in such a brutal war of attrition. The Somme was among the bloodiest battles in Bruno's past life, one that answered the question once and for all. What is the price of a mile? Well, according to figures reported from the end of the battle, 50,000 lives is what a mile of ground was worth in the eyes of the commanders in charge on both sides. Bruno believed that lives of his men were worth far more than a mere mile or two. 50,000 lives for a mile. Only a monster could justify such a price for so little gain. It was the reason he only engaged in battles he knew he could win and without such wasteful expenditure of humanity. If the cost of victory was so great that it would ultimately lead to ruin, then retreat was the most advisable course of action. Pyrrhic victories were not something Bruno ever sought to be known for. Luckily, Bruno had the numerical and technological advantage in the Balkans. And because of this, the majority of his men marched into Montenegro to take the small Balkan kingdom out of commission once and for all, while his own troops supported the Russian and Austro-Hungarian advance into southern Serbia, which was currently the last bastion of the Serbian Provisional Army. Bruno had to admit, the king of Greece, or at least those advising him, knew the opportune moment to enter the war on behalf of the imperial powers. While the combined might of German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian forces converged on what remained of Serbia from the north, the Hellenic army advanced from the south. In doing so, the Serbian Provisional Army had no path of retreat. They could not even march west into Montenegro or Albania, seeking to stall the war with a guerrilla campaign like they had more or less done in Bruno's past life, as 500,000 or more German soldiers were rapidly seizing the two Balkan nations and taking them out of the war early. Serbia's time has come. They had started this war and dragged the world into their demise. Those responsible may be dead, but yet Serbia did not recognize its wrongdoing and kneel before their victims, asking for penance. They sought to resist until the end, and if that was the case, then Bruno was happy to oblige them. One way or another, their choice to continue fighting a war of futility would be the end of their nation and culture, unless someone stepped forward and flew the white flag of peace. Hence why there was a discussion taking place within the city of Niš, which had become the capital of the Serbian Provisional Government, who was currently leading the Serbians in this war and refusing to surrender. Well, the answer to that question was a bit complicated. With the eradication of the usurper, King Peter I of Serbia, and his family during the massacre of Belgrade, rule over Serbia more or less fell to a military junta of the nation's remaining top army officials. These men were currently arguing among themselves over how to proceed with the war effort. The Greek entry into the war was unexpected, and even worse, their advance was far swifter and fiercer than imagined. Apparently, the Hellenic army began mobilizing its forces well before any declaration of war. Serbia, focused on the enemy advancing from the north, and with experienced soldiers available within the field of intelligence and reconnaissance, had failed to detect the Kingdom of Greece amassing its forces on their southern border. These forces, ironically enough, were fitted with weapons given to them and ultra-Orthodox paramilitary organizations who had fought against the Ottomans within the Balkan Wars. It was a superior degree of firepower by a small but highly experienced army which had just emerged victorious from 2 wars in the last 2 years. Needless to say, the poorly trained, and even worse equipped, conscripts of the Serbian Provisional Army began to buckle under the threat of their now 2 war fronts. Luckily for them, French, British, Ottoman, and Italian forces had arrived in the region, and in doing so evening out the numbers for the Allied powers. Either way, the Balkan campaign was about to be decided over the course of the winter of 1914, and hence why these military autocrats were now arguing among themselves over how to proceed. The answer is simple: surrender willingly to the imperial powers. Continuing this fight will be the death of Serbia, and I don't just mean as an independent and sovereign nation, but as a people altogether. We have already lost hundreds of thousands of our men, nearly 1/10 of our population. Are we really going to send every man and boy capable of bearing arms to their deaths? Is subjection to Habsburg rule really so horrific that we must sacrifice our people and our 1,000-plus-year history in the name of sovereignty? These were the words spoken by one military officer among many who disagreed. And by no means were these words hyperbolic or irrational. In fact, it was the most logical opinion on how to proceed expressed thus far. But if human beings were logical and rational beings, then wars like this would not need to be fought in the first place. Serbia had chosen to drag the rest of the world into its defeat, both in this life and its previous timeline. If admitting defeat was so easy, would they not have done so before the war began? Of the 7 deadly sins, pride was perhaps the single most destructive. Pride was the root of all evil. Even the 6 other cardinal sins more often than not stemmed from pride. And it was this that had caused the Great War to begin, and it was ultimately why the other Serbian military officials gazed upon their compatriot with such contempt. Because of this, they indignantly refused to surrender, and hence why the ultimate response to the one wise man among a group of fools was to shame him. Surrender? Now that our allies have finally come to our aid? What madness do you speak of? Do you have any shame in suggesting such a thing when we finally have a chance to avenge our defeats? The military officer who had suggested surrender in order to save themselves and their people could only sigh and shake his head in defeat. He was not the one who felt shame. No, he was very humble with the reality he had been forced into. Whether it was the destruction of half of their professional army at the outbreak of their war, the massacre of their capital and everyone in it, or the death of their veterans who had sacrificed themselves by assaulting the German fortifications around Belgrade to buy them time. There was nothing to feel but humility at these repeated losses against a supreme foe. Rather, it was the men who wished to sacrifice everything for their foolish pride that felt shame in their defeat. After all, pride was the origin of shame, and since these men could not humble themselves, they would rather lead their people to ruin over their own personal confliction. As a result, the officer who had suggested stepped forward, willing to martyr himself in the eyes of his people in order to save them, suggesting an action that he would come to be despised for. If you truly think that my suggestion is so shameful, then allow me to volunteer to prove otherwise. I will lead the provisional army against the Germans in the north. Let me defend what remains of our lands from the invaders and show you all how defiant I truly am in the face of overwhelming odds. The other members of the Serbian military junta looked at one another, silently communicating with each other via nothing more than their gazes for but a moment before finally relenting. Very well. You shall take charge of the army sent to intercept the German advance, while we combine forces with our allies to pressure the Greeks in the south. We expect you and your men to fight until the end, to buy us enough time to capture Athens. Do not bring shame to our people. The military officer who had initially suggested surrender remained utterly silent as he performed a salute, signifying that he understood his orders. What became of him and his men was ultimately up to him, and potentially all of Serbia with them. Chapter 233. Negotiating the Enemy's Surrender Part 1. Bruno sat in the back of his Kubel wagon. His vehicle was on the very edge of the convoy, sitting in the rear with other non-combatant personnel, whether they be logistics personnel or men beyond the risk of death by enemy fire. The advance south would have been much more rapid if they were not relying on the terribly slow speed of human marches and the horses which carried their equipment. As a man who once launched himself into battle via deploying from helicopters within his past life, Bruno had to admit the critical lack of transportation within the early 20th century no doubt contributed to the brutality of trench warfare and the stagnation it had ultimately caused. Even so, there were benefits to the slow speed, such as making it exceptionally difficult to advance beyond your means of supply. Even so, Bruno sat and waited. That is until the call came over the vehicle's radio. The driver quickly got on the comms and spoke with the person on the other end. That is until he looked over at Bruno and announced something shocking to him. The enemy army is waving the white flag. They wish to discuss terms of surrender. Heinrich seemed relieved to hear this information. Any battle that could be won without the need for bloodshed was the best kind there was. Even Sun Tzu would agree with this sentiment, as he once was quoted as saying in his timeless book, The Art of War. Hence, to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. It was indeed entirely possible that the enemy commander, perhaps intimidated both by the scale of Bruno's army and potential misinformation, was willing to raise the white flag and surrender his arms. But Bruno was indeed skeptical of this. By now, French and British forces should have made their way into Serbia to reinforce their ally. In addition to these, as useless and obsolete as the Ottoman army was, they too should have managed to send aid to the Serbians. Why surrender now that there was hope on the horizon? Were his actions in Belgrade so fearsome that they had the intended effect? Did they serve to force his enemies to submit out of fear of complete and total extermination, rather than embolden them to fight until the last man, as they had appeared to have done so until now? Or was this perhaps a trap to ensnare Bruno and eliminate him? There were too many reasons for Bruno's paranoia to prevent him from speaking with the enemy commander, at least under the Serbian terms. Nor was there any neutral ground they could discuss this matter. No, if the Serbians truly wanted to submit to him, they would prove it by coming to his domain and surrendering to his mercy. Because of this, Bruno was quick to make his demands known in order to even begin the negotiations for a potential surrender of the Serbian army that was sent to forestall in advance. Heinrich narrowed his eyes at Bruno upon hearing the demand for the Serbian command to come to him and personally surrender, quickly questioning just what intent the man had by doing so. "You're not planning something sinister, are you?" Bruno simply scoffed at the man before pointing out the real reason his paranoia had kicked in. "Look around you, my old friend, and tell me exactly where we are standing." Heinrich looked around and gazed upon the terrain. Mountains, as far as the eyes could see. Maybe not the spires of the Alps, but there was no doubt raised terrain and trees covering them wherever he looked. When he commented upon this, Bruno nodded his head and then asked his friend another question. So tell me, is it not possible that should I place my faith in my enemy's goodwill and go forth beyond the boundaries of the protection which my army provides me, that I might find my head blown off by a well-placed sniper hiding in the hills obscured by the local foliage? Heinrich's jaw dropped when he realized the utter madness Bruno seemed to have become enveloped in as the war waged on, or at least, such was his perspective. Hence the disbelief and slight contempt in his tone as the man sighed and shook his head. You just see the absolute worst in every human being you come across, don't you? Bruno, of course, responded with a snicker and a smug tone in his voice as he lectured his friend on his own naivety. You see, Heinrich, this is why I will outlive you by at least 3 decades, assuming the cigarettes don't do me in well before I am supposed to naturally expire. Relying on the honor and integrity of your fellow man is a good way to get yourself killed, preemptively anticipating the natural wickedness of mankind, however, and making preparations to mitigate potential harm in every scenario you may find yourself in. That's how you stay alive in this cruel and unforgiving world. Well, then again, I shouldn't put such sins on the world. Rather, the earth would be a beautiful place, almost paradisical if you will. That is, if it weren't for all the goddamn people in it. Listening to Bruno bitch about humanity was something that Heinrich knew he would never be free from so long as he maintained a friendship with the man, and he was quick to point out that perhaps Bruno had chosen the wrong career. You know, with a mentality like that, you should have become a philosopher. I'm sure there are more than a few who would agree with you and your pessimistic view of our species. Bruno did not immediately respond to these words, instead letting out a plume of smoke from yet another cigarette. Fully aware of the danger it posed to his longevity, yet not caring in the slightest as he commented on his own shortcomings and those of humanity as a whole. Are you aware that out of all the religions created by humanity within our recorded history as a species, it is a damn near unanimous consensus that we shall be judged after our death by what actions we take in this life? I'd say that alone is sufficient proof that humanity views itself, at least on some subconscious level, as a wicked being by its very nature. For if we were intrinsically good, why must we all create some kind of supernatural entity to judge as after we have passed? Heinrich simply rolled his eyes as the driver interrupted their conversation, alerting the 2 high-ranking officers about the Serbian commander's response. The enemy commander has agreed to your request and will approach our lines unarmed and on horseback. He is more than willing to temporarily enter our custody in order to negotiate proper terms of surrender. Heinrich then gave Bruno a smug look, while chastising the man for his endless pessimism with a smug tone in his voice. You see, Bruno, not everyone in this world is out to get you. Now how about we go in this campaign once and for all with a proper course of diplomacy, rather than bloodshed? Bruno scoffed. Heinrich was indeed an optimist to the end, and Bruno genuinely believed such a foolish mentality would one day get the man killed. Nevertheless, he was not too proud to admit defeat in the moment, and was quick to accept his friend's moral victory, even if he was still doubtful of the enemy's true intentions. Though I concede that this current circumstance may not necessarily be a plot to kill me, we will ultimately have to wait until these negotiations to see if that is truly the case. After saying this, Bruno ordered the driver to navigate towards the proper area within their own lines where the negotiations with the Serbian commander would be held. Heinrich had a smug smirk on his face throughout the rest of the journey, believing he finally got one over on Bruno. As for Bruno, nothing was conclusive until after the enemy army laid down their arms and fully entered their custody. And yes, he would be alert even within his own ranks towards any potential conspiracy against him. After all, such was the man's nature. Chapter 234. Negotiating the Enemy's Surrender Part 2. The commander of the Serbian army sent with orders of fighting until the last man, in order to buy time for a victory in the south against the Hellenic army, was more or less committing treason. His objective was to negotiate a peaceful surrender with the Germans, not only for his own men, but for all of Serbia. He knew he wasn't exactly in a position to do so, and he also knew that Serbia, or more specifically its royal family in conjunction with the Black Hand, was guilty of a great many crimes. Crimes against not only the Habsburgs, but Bruno personally, as well as many innocent people in the Balkans. At the end of the day, there was nothing he could really do to make amends for these sins. All he could do was ask for more peaceable terms than total annihilation by giving the enemy a show of good behavior. This was entirely the way he had volunteered for this suicide mission, and the commander was all too aware of what his reputation would be should he succeed in his goals. But so long as Serbia survived in some capacity, his personal pride and honor were ultimately meaningless. Even knowing all of this, he and his officer cadre were sweating bullets as they walked through the rank and file of the 300,000 or so Germans who were one of 3 advancing armies across the northern Serbian landscape. Granted, reports stated 1 million Germans were advancing onto the current capital of the Serbian provisional government, and the Serbian commander had assumed Bruno had split his forces, which, while this was true, deciding to capture and occupy more ground with the division of the German, Austro-Hungarian and Russian armies under the control of their own generals. The ultimate misunderstanding was that all 1 million men were German soldiers with advanced equipment, which was a falsehood created by poor training of scouts hastily thrown into their roles. Either way, 300,000 German soldiers surrounding the Serbian cadre and giving them haunted looks were not exactly something that gave a sense of comfort to their guests. Even so, eventually the Serbian officers were brought into Bruno's personal tent, albeit they were thoroughly disarmed and patted down for anything that could remotely be used as a weapon before doing so. Once inside the tent, they found that the entire structure had been hastily constructed. Only a few folding chairs and a small table were set up with not even the slightest of comforts prepared for the Serbian officers acting as diplomats. The only thing Bruno offered was a cigarette to each of them, as he made his stance clear. You offer terms. I ask for nothing less than total surrender. If you are unwilling to accept such demands, then go back to your army and prepare for battle. Utter silence prevailed for a few moments until finally the Serbian officer in charge spoke up. The man wasn't even technically a general, at least he wasn't until hastily promoted to the position after the formation of the Serbian Provisional Army. He sounded completely defeated as he made his stance clear. I understand you want to end this war as soon as possible. It was, after all, a war you did not start, one that has personally affected you in ways I can't truly begin to understand. It stands to reason you would obliterate our capital, especially after our king refused to surrender despite the situation he was in. I am willing to have every man in my army lay down arms and enter your custody until this war is over. In exchange, all I ask is you do not take such excessive actions with the remaining of Serbia as you have done in Belgrade. It is impossible to guarantee that the remainder of the army will do the same. In fact, they are currently in the south combating the Greeks, thinking they have a chance to oppose you. But as far as I am concerned, the war is already lost, and enough blood has been shed to appease the Habsburgs, has it not? As both Bruno and the Serbian officers smoked in silence, Bruno eyed them carefully, watching every twitch of their facial muscles to determine whether the words they spoke were with sincerity or were simply a means to conceal a far more sinister plot. In the end, Bruno only opened his mouth and began to speak his piece after he had put out his cigarette on the ashtray, which was the only thing sitting on the table. You wish to surrender the arms of you and your men in exchange for leniency towards Serbia and its people? Your terms are acceptable, assuming of course the remainder of the forces we have to fight don't do anything foolish to provoke an excessive response. I can agree to your terms. The usurper and his wicked spawn have been gassed into extinction. The men responsible for the death of the Austrian Archduke are either all in custody or have choked to death on mustard gas. And the people who have caused unnecessary bloodshed in the objective of stoking national and ethnic tensions in the region have been rounded up and shot against the wall. There is no further reason for your people to suffer to such an extent, not unless they decide to continue this war in an extended and bloody guerrilla campaign. If you want peace, then tell the Serbian people to lay down their arms and accept their defeat as you have done. Allow me to make myself abundantly clear as my men march further southward into your lands. Should we encounter any resistance by militias, partisans, or any other form of uniformed combatant taking up arms against our occupation, I will take 10 heads for every one rebel I come across. and another 10 further forever casualty the men beneath my command sustain. I want you to truly understand what this means as I accept your terms. Because if you disagree with such tactics, then you have every right to go back to your army and fight us until your last dying breath. Though, I would not recommend such a foolish and reckless course of action. The look in Bruno's sky-blue eyes as he spoke these words to the Serbian officers was enough to lower the room's temperature by a full 50 degrees. He was not exaggerating in the slightest when he made such a threat. No, a promise to the men trying to negotiate a more peaceable end to the Balkan campaign. He would very much tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of innocent people to avenge the loss of his men killed by civilians and not soldiers. After all, that was the only way to truly win a war against an enemy engaging in a guerrilla campaign. Either wipe out the population to the last man, so that nobody was left to resist your occupation, or make the people truly understand that was the ultimate end for them should they continue to fight such a futile war was extinction. Survival was a basic human instinct, and it was very easy to write off the men, women, and children that Bruno would inevitably line up against the wall in retaliation for the deaths of his soldiers killed during the occupation as ununiformed combatants who were currently not protected by the rules of war. After all, his soldiers dying in battle against a proper army was a natural consequence of war, but their deaths at the hands of partisans? Such a thing required excessive and brutal response, or else they would continue to fight and kill Bruno's men, who at the end of the day he valued the lives of far more than the innocent people he occupied. This was one of Bruno's largest complaints about how the ISAF handled themselves in Afghanistan during his past life when he was a soldier fighting there. In accordance with the rules of war as they existed in the 21st century, coalition forces ultimately chose to sacrifice the lives of their soldiers in order to prioritize the lives of Afghani civilians rather than level entire villages where the Taliban hid and occupied, more often than not with the aid of those very civilians who were being protected by the ISAF. Even if such a thing became international law in his time serving as a German general in this life, Bruno would never put the lives of his own men at risk in exchange for prioritizing the safety of civilians who lived in an active war zone. The lives of every single one of his soldiers were worth more than 1 million Serbians, Italians, Frenchmen, or any other country he marched into. And he would conduct war with such a mentality if need be. Considering the way Bruno had clarified this stance, and the almost demonic gaze that accompanied his monstrous words, the Serbian officers were quick to agree to Bruno's requests and would gladly act as propaganda pieces to help coerce the local Serbian population not to engage in any violent behavior towards German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian peacekeeping forces. Chapter 235: Consequences of Aggressive Negotiations. The moment the Serbian army, which was sent to intercept the Germans in the northern half of the territory that more or less currently remained under the control of the Serbian Provisional Government, surrendered, all hell broke loose among the Allies. This was a severe matter, as this was roughly half of Serbia's remaining combat might, albeit primarily made of conscripts, being sent on a suicide mission. Even with the men sent by the French, British, and Ottomans to assist the Serbians, it was not enough to prevent the complete and total collapse of their northern front. Worse yet, radio broadcasts were being made across the country, as were any other means of propaganda, whether that be publication, posters, influence in the local churches, etc., where the words being spoken were entirely made to convince the Serbians that peaceful surrender was their guarantee of being treated better than Belgrade was. Even those who may have had an initial desire to take up arms and attack imperial occupying forces hesitated to do so when they were called upon by their own leadership to resist such an urge for chaos and violence. At the end of the day, the Serbians felt like they had been completely and totally betrayed by their own forces, or at least those within the leadership who still wished to cling to their pride in the face of what was clear and overwhelming defeat. And while the British, Ottoman, and French commanders in charge of their expeditionary forces, which were at most a brigade or two each, convened to discuss their next course of action, Montenegro came under the full assault of some 500,000-plus German soldiers who convened upon it from the north and eastern flanks. In Bruno's past life, the Serbian army had been forced to withdraw from their own borders within less than a year of the hostilities beginning. However, They had fled successfully into Montenegro, where they more or less kept the overall theater of war open until essentially the end of the war in 1918. This had consumed hundreds of thousands if not millions of men and the resources required to supply them. A mistake Bruno did not intend to make in this life. From the moment Montenegro entered the war, Bruno used the excuse of them ferrying Allied troops and supplies into Serbia as an excuse to completely and totally obliterate them as a sovereign kingdom. Montenegro was a small kingdom, capable of fielding at most 50,000 men in its army, most of which were wielding vastly obsolete equipment, facing 10 times their numbers in modern German soldiers, deployed via motorized means in both infantry and logistics. The Montenegrin campaign was over before it began. The only reason it really held out so long in Bruno's past life was due to its small territory, which was supported by hundreds of thousands of Serbian soldiers who fled into its territory following Serbia's occupation by the Central Powers, and because of its access to the Mediterranean, which more or less allowed Allied material support of their defense. Two things, however, had occurred in this life that prevented such a result. First and foremost, and also the most unexpected, was the Greek entry into the war. While the Hellenic army was inferior in scale and equipment to the Bulgarian army, the Hellenic navy proved its value tenfold over Bulgaria's assistance to the Central Powers during Bruno's previous life. By itself, Austro-Hungary's KUK Kriegsmarine did not have the strength to blockade Montenegro. After all, they had to also combat attacks on their convoys by the Allies and the Italian navy for control over the Adriatic, which was something which ultimately stressed the Austro-Hungarian navy and made its control over the Balkans thin. However, this changed with the addition of the Hellenic navy supporting their interests. While admittedly small, the addition of even a small amount of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines was all that was needed to fully deter the Allies from landing troops and supplies in Montenegro. Montenegro had only been able to ferry a small number of at most 20,000 troops from Britain, France, and the Ottomans combined into their lands, while still acting under the false guise of neutrality. These forces now had already crossed over to support Serbia in its efforts to combat the Greeks. At most, a division worth of coalition forces had entered Serbia, which while the British and French forces were generally better supplies and trained than the Serbians, the Ottomans were utterly useless. Their entry into World War I on behalf of the Central Powers during Bruno's past life came with the transfer of German generals to reform them into a more modern and capable army, along with German warships added to their ranks. Considering British naval losses suffered during the outbreak of war trying to send aid to their allies in France, no such maritime support came from the British Empire. And much to the anger of the Turks, the British used the battleships they were manufacturing for the Turks as replacements for their losses against the German high seas fleet, justifying this breach of contract by the promise of sending men and resources to support the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans and in their war against the Russians in the Caucasus, or what remained of their forces there. However, such aid manifested itself in the form of a few brigades sent to Serbia and zero support to the Caucasus. With the Kaiserlich Marine more or less coming to dominate the North Sea and the English Channel, they began sending a small contingent of wolf packs to the Mediterranean after learning of Allied plans to support Serbia and the Ottomans. Considering the advanced nature of Germany's current submarine fleet, it was damn near impossible for the British to understand what was sinking their trade convoys and warships in the region, as they had yet to encounter a single intact Type XXI submarine. Hence why the complete and total betrayal of the Serbian Northern Army Group, which surrendered to Bruno without a fight, proved so disastrous for the Allied powers and their goals in the region. Without a doubt, they would either have to divert already limited forces to counter the rapid and motorized advance of the enemy in the north, or focus all of their efforts on combating the Hellenic army, who were dug in like ticks in their own territory. Chapter 236. How does one proceed when betrayed by their allies? With contested seas and naval blockades across Montenegro's borders, landing troops and supplies in the Balkans was a difficult process for the Allies. A process which only became more difficult with the introduction of Greece into the war on behalf of the imperial powers. Montenegro and its 50,000 men found themselves quickly encircled by the German forces. Bruno split off from his main army that equally were greater than 10 times the number of defenders. At most, the Allies managed to land a division worth of their soldiers in the region, and that was combined across its many nations. This division was currently trying their best to gain ground in Greece, where the Hellenic army was rather incredibly holding its ground for the most part. Outnumbered and fighting on two fronts, the Serbians and Greeks were in a similar position. The difference was, the imperial powers advancing from the north of Serbia consisted of the top 3 largest, most well-trained, and most technologically advanced armies in the world, while Greece was combating less than 30,000 men of actual modern capabilities in their north, with the remaining being conscripts thrust into battle with limited training and obsolete equipment. Perhaps the Greeks could have been pressured into splitting their forces had Bulgaria entered the war, but currently they were watching and waiting. Frankly speaking, their only reason for joining the war was to gain territory contested with the Greeks. But they would only have such acquisitions should the Allies win. And as 1914 came to a close, the Allies were the very clear losers from any perspective other than their own. Bulgaria had chosen not to enter the war. As a result, the Greeks only had one border to defend, and that was their border with Serbia, as neutral Albania blocked a Montenegrin disruption in the northwest, and Thrace was currently under Bulgarian possession. Meaning that other than by sending troops into Montenegro to aid Serbia, the Ottoman Empire, no matter how close they were to their Balkan ally, had no means of directly advancing into Greece without first dragging the Bulgarians into the conflict. Not to mention that in this life, it was no exaggeration to say that the Ottomans had replaced the Austro-Hungarians as the second worst army in the world, just behind the Italians. After all, most of the issues plaguing the Austro-Hungarian army in Bruno's past life had been solved to a sufficient enough degree thanks to his input during this new timeline. Because of this, the British and French officers commanding the brigades that were sent to the Balkans were now forced to have a serious and grim conversation about the current reality they were facing together. The Allied expeditionary force sent to the Balkans were led by a British brigadier general. The man was not in the best of moods after recent events, and he naturally gave voice to these grievances with an inflection in his tone that hinted he was struggling to keep things together. I have to say, the surrender of the Serbian Provisional Army sent to buy us time against the imperial powers in the north was not exactly an expected occurrence. And now we sit here in south, with our flanks entirely exposed to an enemy which is quickly advancing upon our position entirely uncontested. Even worse, any resistance we would have otherwise expected from the local populace has been completely nullified by the Serbian traitors' words, which the Germans have abused every form of medium they can to get them to the masses. I hate to admit it, but things are not looking good for us. We either end up trapped between two armies and get obliterated in the process, or we find a way to jump ship and get out of this mess we have found ourselves in. Neither the French nor Ottoman commander looked like they had any better suggestions as they silently eyed each other before sighing and shaking their heads in an act of complete and utter defeat. Nobody really knew what they could do. Fleeing wasn't exactly an option. Serbia had no coastline, and by now any escape route through Montenegro had been thoroughly cut off, not only by the imperial power's naval blockade of its shorelines, but also because the Imperial Army Group had by now cut off any access to Montenegro's borders through their occupation of Serbia. Could they rally their forces together and make a desperate attempt to break through German-occupied territory? Of course, but even if they managed to get into Montenegro, what then? By the time they even reached the coast, the Germans would have forced the Montenegrin army to capitulate. The other option was to open discussions with Albania and Bulgaria for military access so they could peacefully flee to Ottoman lands. Albania, however, was in a complete and total state of anarchy as various groups waged war for power after its German prince fled the country at the start of the war. There was no single entity to negotiate military access with that would be universally recognized across the lawless nation. So then, Bulgaria was the logical option, except for the fact that Bulgaria had more or less made a statement of dedication to total neutrality after Greece's entry into the war. This total neutrality was, of course, contingent on the imperial powers continuing on their inevitable route to victory. But, in the meantime, It meant they were not taking sides, and that meant there was not much to discuss regarding allowing them to flee through Bulgarian borders into Ottoman territory. Because by doing so Bulgaria risked provoking the imperial powers, and that was not something they were willing to do even if it meant currying favor with the Allies, who as far as Bulgaria was concerned was about half a year away from total defeat. No, after the British general spoke, even he understood the foolishness of his words. Abandon ship? That simply wasn't a practical solution, no matter how much they tried to think of one. Realistically, they had three options: double down on their efforts to advance into Greece and force the minor power to surrender before their allies could catch up. Fight until the last man, and in doing so, condemn themselves and their men to meaningless deaths. Or surrender like the northern half of the Serbian Provisional Army had done. Either way, the Serbian commander in charge of the force sent to intercept Bruno had doomed the Balkans to a complete and utter defeat. One that would allow between 1 and 2 million men across 3 nations to be sent to other theaters of war, and allow the entirety of the Hellenic army and navy to focus its forces on capturing disputed territory with the Ottoman Empire. The war had just shifted even further into the favor of the imperial powers, and nobody but Bruno and the other military leadership in the Balkans currently understood this fact. Chapter 237. Who Dares Wins. The order was given. The Allied expeditionary force sent to the Balkans to aid the Serbian Provisional Army was commanded to march south and attempt another assault against the Greek trenches built, which were hastily constructed on their borders with Serbia beginning at the start of the July crisis. To put it simply, the Greek army was putting its all into holding the line, while raising more troops in anticipation of a second campaign against the Turks. Their hope was that the enemy would be caught by the Germans before their defenses broke against the wave of the Allied onslaught. Luckily for them, they had a man who, while cautious in nature, was by no means reserved for leading the combined imperial army sent to the Balkan theater. For Bruno, there was a phrase, first attested in the 18th century by German sources. The phrase consisted of 3 words later adopted by the British Special Air Service in English as their motto, and in many ways, it was a motto which Bruno lived by. W.R. wagged, G went, or in the English tongue, he who dares wins. A simple phrase, but one which emphasizes the need to take opportunities that present themselves even if they are a risk. One could never gain ground and conquer while playing defensively. Risks were necessary to achieve victory. He who was dedicated solely towards a cautious and defensive approach, whether to aspects of war, business, romance, or life itself, would never prosper. Risk was a part of life, and only the man who dared to take the opportunity presented to him would win in the end. The war Bruno saw it. He was facing an armed force of mostly conscripts and some 30,000 trained soldiers. The enemies he was facing numbered close to 1 million in totality, even with the surrender of those who had presented themselves to him in exchange for leniency on the Serbian people. Bruno had the ability to advance beyond his allies with 300,000 men. It would be more, but the other 500,000 of Germany's soldiers in the Balkans were currently teaching Montenegro a very valuable lesson on why one does not start or join a war they are utterly incapable of winning. And because of that, Bruno was limited to a single army group. Even so, this was a motorized army group supported by armored reconnaissance units. He could easily pierce the gap between him and Serbia, catching them and their allies in between the Hellenic army at the Greek border and slaughtering them to the last man. However, to do so, Bruno would need to take a risk. He would have to advance beyond not only his Austro-Hungarian and Russian allies, who were not only slow as they marched on foot and on horse, but were also the majority of his forces, many of which were tasked with occupying every town they encountered. In addition to this, Bruno would have to march beyond the capability of his logistical capabilities. History had proven time and again. The general who sought a quick finish to a conflict by advancing beyond his means of resupply ultimately suffered the consequences of such a reckless yet bold decision. However, on the rare occasion it bore fruit and finished a war, or at the very least a campaign, in a much quicker time than it otherwise would have been and with much shorter casualties sustained. Because of this, Bruno found himself in a difficult situation. On the one hand, victory was guaranteed even if he took a cautious and measured approach towards the war. waiting on his Austro-Hungarian and Russian allies to march with him to certain victory. Yet, there was a possibility the Greek lines of defense would break by then, and the results of such a circumstance could prolong his victory in the Balkans, drag in otherwise independent nations like Bulgaria, Albania, and Romania, as well as cause significantly greater casualties among his soldiers. However, even with these potential circumstances presenting themselves, the cautious and measured approach guaranteed total victory for the imperial powers. On the other hand, however, a thunder run into southern Serbia, which until he reached the enemy currently fighting on the Greek border were wholly uncontested, presented an opportunity to annihilate the Serbian Provisional Army and their allies to the last man, immediately ending the war as the year came to an end, and guaranteeing the imperial forces in the Balkans, minus those needed to occupy towns and cities, were shipped off to other theaters of combat, and thus ending the Great War far earlier than it could be. Bruno would sit in the back of his vehicle for many hours as they slowly dredged forward towards the enemy, pondering this question. He could not come to the conclusion on his own. The risks and rewards were perfectly balanced. Because of this, the man sought out the advice of the person whose opinion he valued the most in this world. It was neither his battle-hardened friends, Heinrich or Erich, both of which had served as officers in the German armed forces for the past decade. Nor was it the esteemed generals of the Russian army, or the Austro-Hungarian army who history in his past life had remembered as men of greatness. It was not even the Kaiser, who Bruno greeted, respected. In fact, it was not even a man to begin with. As Bruno went through the extensive process of enabling communications back to the fatherland, Bruno asked his wife, Heidi, for advice. Heidi knew neither of war nor its intricacies, but she was his moral support in every facet of his life. And the question he was faced with was not one of practicality, risk mitigation, strategy, logistics, or tactics. It was one of ethics. Was it immoral of him to risk the lives of the men beneath his command in order to risk a quicker route to victory, when the enemy's certain defeat was already a settled matter, even if it took another few months, or perhaps even years to achieve? Heidi, of course, responded with the phrase mentioned earlier, a phrase Bruno had nearly forgotten in his moral quandary. Bruno, my love, he who dares wins. That is all I am going to say on the matter. And it was those words that compelled Bruno due to what he should have done from the start. After receiving this message from his wife, Bruno relayed his commands over the wire to every officer within the Balkan campaign. The Eighth Army is to advance south at full speed beyond the support of our Austro-Hungarian and Russian allies. The Hellenic army must be relieved, and the enemy must be destroyed as soon as possible. To those still advancing south, seize and occupy territory as you have done. Until now. To every man who read this message over a telegraph or heard it over radio chatter, it was as if the mother of all bombs had been dropped. The blitzkrieg in the Balkans had begun, and the Germans were about to show the entire world a new era of mobile warfare. Chapter 238, Thunder Run. Engines roared, both among the 3.5-ton transport trucks which carried troops, supplies, and field guns, along with those on board the armored scout cars. Scout cars, which were more or less assembled from an E-10 chassis that had been modified for use with 6x6 large off-road tires. The initial Spa-Panzer, as it was called, was modeled on a design from the Cold War of Bruno's past life. But as wartime demands increased and assembly lines were put to their limit, it was revealed that simply modifying the E-10 chassis for a wheelbase was a more efficient use of resources. The E-10 Standard Panzer, or simply the Panzer I as it was known in this life, while having been in production for years, had yet to see service and was instead being reserved for the final days of the war when the German army pushed into Paris. However, necessity was the mother of innovation, and there was no better time for such a thing in regards to military technology than during an armed conflict. Much to Bruno's surprise, engineers employed by his arms corporations came up with a way to make an armored scout car off of the E-10 chassis. Until now, the light tank chassis, which made the foundation of this timeline's tank on the Panzer I, housed both a 5cm semi-automatic turret and a 7.92 by 57mm Mauser MG-34 machine gun. It was a traditional tank design, albeit with lessons having been learned during the brutal battlefields of the Second World War during Bruno's past life. And Bruno had made this his basis for the Panzer in this life. If scaled up, it could produce even more powerful tank designs, as well as armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery and anti-aircraft, infantry fighting vehicles, etc., all with the same production lines and resources. As brilliant as Bruno was, which was compounded by his access to weapons technology from his past life, which had occurred nearly a century in the future, he was not beyond his faults. He was, after all, still a mortal man. And as a man, he was prone to biases, which were displayed with his initial creation of the Spa-Panzer. Even so, men in his employment who were of near equal brilliance were capable of looking past his biases, and instead producing an equally capable armored car, yet was far more cost-productive and less wasteful. This meant that after months of field testing in the war, the realization that the E-10 chassis could be modified to accept an 8x8 wheeled base and a 2 cm autocannon, with limited alterations, was a wake-up call to Bruno that sometimes an alternative perspective was needed to understand that just because something had been the best design in his past life did not mean it was the most suitable design during this new timeline. Because of this, the armored cars which advanced beyond the transport trucks acting as the spearhead of Bruno's Blitzkrieg were a mixture of what Bruno called the Spa-Panzer OSF A and OSF B models. Sitting on top of these vehicles were squads of German soldiers who were ready to jump off of their armored escorts and engage in combat at a moment's notice. Tactically speaking, Bruno's version of the Blitzkrieg was almost like a mixture of the German Blitzkrieg from his past life and that of the Soviet deep battle doctrine, and was more inspired by the so-called Thunder Run into Baghdad during Operation Desert Storm than it was the German march into Paris. Either way, with the armored vehicles leading the assault, Bruno's 300,000 soldiers swarmed across uncontested Serbian territory quicker than anyone could have anticipated. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian and Russian armies who were lagging behind acted more than an occupying force, dealing with whatever was left over after the Germans had pushed through Serbia. The advance was so quick, even Bruno was surprised, let alone his enemies who were sweating bullets as they realized the dust in the distance was not some kind of unnatural sandstorm in the Mediterranean, but rather the rapid onslaught of the German army, who had caught up much quicker than they expected. Deciding on doubling down, the Allied commanders insisted on a push into a Greek territory in a desperate gamble to break the lines of the Hellenic army, which had until now held firm. The result of which was unfortunately not as they expected it to be. Greek soldiers held firm, with Stahlhelms supported by German industry, albeit painted in an appropriate earthly brown to match their uniforms, along with the Hellenic army's coat of arms emblazoned on its center. With a mixture of weapons in hands from previous conflicts and various suppliers, the Greek soldiers desperately held the line, fighting with everything they had to repel the Serbian charge as well as their allies. Their generals had assured them that so long as they held the border, their allies would soon arrive upon them. But munitions were running low, as were medical supplies and rations. Yet the spirit of Greece's many legendary heroes stood firm in the wounded, battered, and emaciated soldiers' hearts as they conserved their shots by only firing when they knew their aim would strike true into the vitals of their enemies. If Emperor Constantine XI could choose to die with his empire, if Leonidas could choose to die with his men rather than submit to the Persians, then why could each and every one of these soldiers not die here today, bringing down as many of their enemies with them? There were no circumstances where the line would not be held by these lions among men, by these descendants of legendary kings and mythical heroes, especially when they knew help was on the way. The only way these defenses would falter was if there was not a single breath still being held among the men within them. Machine guns chugged, rifles thundered, artillery raged on both sides. Men fell by the wayside, their blood and intestines hewn the otherwise beautiful landscape, and yet not a single order to retreat was given by the Greek generals. Surrounded, outnumbered, and stretched thin, the Hellenic army continued to fight, continued to resist, and bite of an enemy force over 5x their number. Losses were heavy on both sides, but far more for the Allies who were relying on poorly trained conscripts armed with obsolete weapons and non-standardized munitions. When one man fell, a Serbian conscript would pick up his weapon and use it himself, assuming he had run out of ammo himself. And that was also if he had not been shot by Greek rifle or machine gun fired during his charge. A scent of blood, gunpowder, and smoke filled the air in the most gruesome and sickening way imaginable, as the screams of the wounded blended with the sounds of gunfire and artillery. Despite their repeated charges, it was the Allies whose morale broke first, especially after the dust began to form in the distance, which was first presumed to be a storm of unnatural origin, but then the appearance of armored vehicles and the men sitting upon their steel hulls became apparent. And when that happened, the Allies knew they had been caught between the heroic Greek defenders and the advance of an unspeakable evil, one so great even Hades would look away at the malevolent force of nature which was about to sweep over them. Before the Allies could even surrender, the 20mm auto cannons opened fire as the armored cars came to a halt, allowing the men on the backs of each to deploy into prone positions with their machine guns and semi-automatic rifles. The armored cars acted as shields for the transport trucks behind them, which allowed platoons worth of German soldiers to deploy from their rears. More and more firepower was brought to bear on the Allied forces, as they struggled to both deal with the newly rallied Greeks in front of them, many of which waved makeshift banners of St. Constantine's cross, while others flew the colors of Greece herself. However, even the Greek defenders were surprised when a man wearing the uniform of a German general stepped forward, waving a black banner, with a white chiro, symbolizing his unity with the Greek soldiers, shouting to his troops a command that would seal the fate of the Allied forces within the Balkans. Do not stop firing until every last Allied soldier lies dead. Only when our enemy has been obliterated can we unite with our Greek brothers in arms and drive the Turkish menace from the lands of Europe and Christendom once and for all. In the coming year of 1915, St. Constantine's holy city shall be returned to its rightful rulers. Bruno had decided to fully radicalize his troops into obliterating the enemy, seizing what remained of Serbia, while his splinter forces took Montenegro, before working with Greek forces to advance into Constantinople and in doing so drive the Turks out of Europe once and for all. The campaign in the Balkans would only end once the Allies in the region capitulated, and Greece regained control over its historical territory. There was no other solution now that Bruno had decided to embark on this path. Chapter 239, Meritocracy Above All. Tattered banners on the Greek border were the headlines that appeared throughout international news outlets over the course of the following days, depicted corpses as far as the eyes could see, many of which were grouped together around both national and regimental colors. To put it simply, after being caught in between the German army and their rapid advance, as well as the courageous sons of Leonidas who held their ground long enough against overwhelming odds for it to pay off, the Allied forces in the south of Serbia were completely annihilated. Annihilation in terms of military context didn't necessarily mean the death or injury of every soldier. It simply meant reducing the enemy military's capabilities to fight to a non-existent level, forcing the enemy commanders to surrender. And surrender they did, but only after losing the majority of their entire force. What remained of the Serbian Provisional Army, or at least those who had not found a way to desert the chaos with their lives intact, had surrendered their arms and waved the white flag. But enough casualties were sustained to forever change the course of Serbia's history as a nation. Even though the Austro-Hungarians and Russians were miles behind their German allies, having not yet even captured the city where the Serbian provisional government hid away, the war in Serbia itself had effectively come to an end. All that was needed was for Bruno to officially accept their surrender. And surrender they would. There was no other option. Even their attempts to rally their entire population, which was capable of taking up arms, had resulted in an unmitigated disaster. There was simply no feasible solution for them to continue to resist. Serbia had fallen, and Montenegro was surrounded and currently being assaulted by German forces on all sides. This meant that the only other player in the Balkans currently on the Allied side was the Ottoman Empire, who were already dealing with an invasion from Russian-occupied Armenia into their territory in Anatolia. However, with Serbia's fall, Thrace had now become Bruno's concern. There was just a matter of finding out how exactly to launch such an invasion. Hence why he first decided to deal with the aftermath of battle, along with visiting the Serbian provisional government where he would wait for the German Kaiser, Austro-Hungarian Emperor, Russian Tsar, and of course the King of Greece to come together and force some form of peace treaty acknowledging their victory, in whatever terms the Habsburgs required for satisfaction. Bruno had no way of knowing it, but the Kaiser was extremely tempted to just throw medals at him. Technically speaking, the man had already accomplished all that qualified for awards that had only ever been given to monarchs. For example, the Grand Cross of the Poor Lumarite with oak leaves. But Bruno was only really now showing his capabilities as an exceptional military commander on behalf of the German army. Every battle he had won in the past for the fatherland was a junior officer during the Boxer Rebellion. And those were small-scale skirmishes in a war not worthy of issuing a grand decoration such as the Iron Cross. Not to mention, there were certain people whispering in Wilhelm's ears like his own daughter towards a more measures approach with rewards rather than just spamming the man with them. After all, there would be many more opportunities for Bruno to prove himself, and history would look far more kindly on the German Reich's greatest general if he had to struggle for each award given, rather than just be handed them out for convenience. Hence, Bruno was not the least surprised to find that he was being granted 2 medals for his victory over Serbia. First and foremost, he was being given the Iron Cross First Class for his destruction of the Serbian Royal Army at the opening stages of the war, as well as his defense of Belgrade after its extermination and occupation. In addition to this, Bruno was granted the Knight's Cross with Swords of the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern, which since the outbreak of the war had begun being issued as an intermediate award between the Iron Cross First Class and the Poor Lumarite. Bruno knew more or less that with his repeated and overwhelming victories, the Kaiser intended to give the man the highest class of medals for valor on the battlefield. Thus, even though other men such as the Red Baron, who had quickly become the first and greatest flying ace of the war, had been granted a Poor Lumarite for his service, Bruno had yet to be given 1. Because the Poor Lumarite came in 4 grades. The Poor Lumarite with oak leaves, the Grand Cross of the Poor Lumarite, and the Grand Cross of the Poor Lumarite with oak leaves. 5 men throughout the history of Bruno's past life had the honor of being granted the Grand Cross of the Poor Lumarite, all of which were either members of the House of Hohenzollern themselves or foreign monarchs. While even less had been granted the Supreme Award for military performance and valor, which was the Grand Cross of the Poor Lumarite with oak leaves. The award, which was more or less Prussia, and by extent the German Reich's greatest award for courage on the battlefield, also came in a civilian variation for exceptional achievements to society. But this was not of consequence to Bruno, who was a soldier first and foremost. Because of this, he rather rightly assumed the Kaiser was waiting until he won the war on behalf of the German Reich altogether to give him Germany's greatest honor, and instead his next award after defeating Serbia would likely be after he had concluded the Balkan campaign altogether, which would either come in the form of one of Prussia's many chivalric orders, or perhaps a lesser order or merit, or maybe even the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross. Either way, Bruno was completely and totally unfazed when the Kaiser pinned the 2 medals to his chest that he had earned after arriving along with his allies in Belgrade, which was solely inhabited by the soldiers of the imperial powers for the sake of having a conference with the Serbian provisional government regarding their surrender. Bruno's promotion to the rank of General Feldmarschall within his mid-30s was indeed unprecedented, but it was also perhaps because of this that he was by far the least decorated of the men throughout history who had held such a rank. Even now, with these 2 new medals, he was still woefully undecorated. And because Bruno personally wore only the medals recognized by the German Reich with his uniform, there were even lieutenant colonels beneath his command who walked around with more medals on their chests than he had. Despite this, nobody dared to make a snide remark about this. Bruno's rapid rise through the ranks of the German army had been purely due to the meritocratic society that he lived in at this point in time. In a true meritocracy, the exceptional rose to the top at a far quicker rank than the mediocre. Minimum time requirements for one's promotion sounded good in theory, but the reality was that this only imposed restrictions on the exceptional and favored those far less capable. Think of it this way. Would you rather have a 35-year-old prodigy on par with history's greatest strategists in control of your army, or a 65-year-old man who was nothing exceptional, but had been in the military long enough to achieve his status, while said 35-year-old still had yet to meet the minimum time requirements to become a colonel. Do you think that Alexander the Great, at the age of 20 when he ascended to the throne, was somehow less worthy of leading his armies to victory than his father's generals who had been in the Macedonian army for the entirety of their lives? Strict adherence to service length requirements more often than not made the exceptional fed up with their position in the military and retire before they truly lived up to their potential. And because of this, in the era following Napoleon's rise, which was largely because of his belief in meritocracy, Bruno was allowed to become a general feldmarschall at such a young age. Whereas he had never come anywhere close to such a prestigious rank during his past life, because of the Bundeswehr's rejection of lessons learned by greater men and far superior nations from the past. Either way, Bruno did not complain in the slightest about the lack of medals pinned to his chest in comparison to his foes, for his achievements on the battlefield in this life were more than enough to gain him the respect he had earned, even if he didn't have the bits of metal and cloth to prove it. Meritocracy was above all, and Bruno was the living embodiment of such ideals. Chapter 240. Serbia surrenders. The streets of Belgrade were a constant reminder of what had once been and what would never be. The fog of mustard gas had long since been purged from the city, and its inhabitants were buried in mass graves outside of its boundaries. Over 100,000 people had died here if you included the elements of the army who stood in its defense, as well as the citizens located within. Their souls were forever tortured by the miasma of poison which choked their lives out of existence, and with no warning no less. From the highest king to the lowliest rat, not a single being, human or otherwise, had been spared the extermination that had taken place here. But months had passed since then, and the war in Serbia had come to an end as the year 1914 came to its final weeks. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor Franz Joseph I, Tsar Nicholas II, and King Constantine I of Greece all sat together in the same room across from the representatives of the temporary military junta, which at this moment were the de facto rulers of the Kingdom of Serbia. The only other people present in the city were soldiers of the imperial powers, who had since branded themselves as the Central Powers with Greece's entry into the war, as Greece was not an empire, and instead a minor power throwing their weight in with the big three European imperial dynasties. Thus bringing things full circle, as the faction which Germany had been a part of in this life was rebranded with the same name as it had in his past life. The only other person privy to these discussions was none other than Bruno himself, who stood in the corner with his newly pinned medals. The ribbon of his Iron Cross First Class was worn with the clasp of the Knight's Cross with swords of the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern, which consisted of a golden crown with cross swords pinned to the fabric that was adorned across his top button. In addition to this, Bruno had his Iron Cross First Class pinned to his left breast beneath his heart, and the multitude of German military medals above it. Whether that was his initial China medal from his participation in the Boxer Rebellion, his Iron Cross Second Class, or his Cross of the Iron Division Second Class. These awards were all pinned precisely where they should be beneath his greatcoat, which covered their brilliance. The only other visible award was his Cross of the Iron Division First Class, which hung from the neck beneath his collar and proudly displayed the insignia of his rank as a general feldmarschall. Bruno sat silently on the windowsill, smoking outside of its open panes, which allowed the cold snow and winter air into the room, while the various leaders argued about terms of surrender. Serbia stood proudly, albeit foolishly, as they debated with their conquerors about appropriate terms of surrender that benefited them. Apparently too stupid, or more accurately proud, to admit they had no actual means to continue this armed conflict and had been thoroughly trounced by Bruno and his Thunder Run. As a result, the Serbian host openly and blatantly squabbled with the leaders of the Central Powers, who were trying patiently to convey to these stubborn old fools that they had lost. Completely unacceptable. Serbia is to become a territory of the Hungarian crown? I won't have it. After everything you have done here, do you really think that we will just let you have your way? I would rather die than admit defeat. So you better just. Shock filled the room as a thunderous echo ranged throughout it, spurring the armed guards of the German Reich to lower their weapons, searching for the culprit. Bruno simply lowered his Mauser C96 and holstered it, the bullet having been precisely aimed to shoot the cigarette out of the hands of the Serbian general who had dared to espouse such nonsense, and in doing so causing the man to thoroughly soil his trousers. Bruno's gaze was cold as he stowed his pistol away and took a long drag off of his own cigarette before thoroughly explaining his thoughts in the most murderous tone he could muster. If you all wish to die, this can be arranged. Your army is broken, your lands are conquered. Your people have wholly submitted to the rule of the Habsburgs, who I might remind you, you provoked with unwarranted murder of their presumed heir. You have nothing left, except for your damned pride. And if that means I have to kill a few stubborn old fools in order to resolve this matter without having to gas another town, then I am sure the mass graves I have dug outside this city can accommodate a few more corpses. After all, your capital, which we now sit within, was thoroughly exterminated under my order. Did you senile old bastards seriously forget who you were dealing with here? Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to chastise Bruno for his rather wanton use of force, especially the unpermitted discharging of a firearm within his presence. But honestly, the man's murderous aura was so frightening even he felt slightly intimidated by it, despite knowing it was not the least bit directed at him. Franz Joseph Damm near had a heart attack upon hearing the random gunshot, and Tsar Nicholas II simply gazed upon Bruno with a look that consisted of a mixture of surprise, approval, and pride. Needless to say, any resistance these doddering old fools who called themselves the current rulers of Serbia had left remaining quickly crumbled when Bruno reminded them he was the butcher of this city. The peace treaty, which guaranteed Serbia's disarmament, occupation, annexation, and complete and total surrender, had been signed by both parties. The nation was thoroughly annexed by the Habsburgs within their lands under the authority of the Hungarian crown. Though honestly, Bruno doubted these gains would last for very long. Frankly put, Austro-Hungary was doomed to collapse within the coming decades regardless of whether or not they ended up winning this war. At the end of the day, different religions, cultures, and ethnicities could never inhabit the same land for long without bloodshed occurring. Austro-Hungary was a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious society, and because of that it was doomed to burn. In fact, Bruno doubted it would survive another 2 decades before violence erupted within the nation's borders, especially with the annexation of Serbia, which only added to this internal strife. The war would likely be very bloody, as it had similarly been when Yugoslavia, the successor state to the Austro-Hungarian, fell apart during the 1990s of Bruno's past life. And this was perhaps the biggest middle finger in the history of the region. The state which the young Bosnians and Black Hand wanted to create as an independent state lasted fewer years than the Austro-Hungarian Empire they sought to destroy. That is, unless you included the interwar years before the region fell apart and was invaded and annexed by various powers, before once more gaining their independence under a completely different banner and ideology. Frankly speaking, Bruno doubted in this modern era any pan-Balkan state could exist for a century, let alone longer. It was too diverse of a region, with too many reasons for its people to kill one another. God, culture, nation, those were the 3 things humans fought over most, aside from perhaps resources. And believe me, when it came to civil wars, resources mattered very little. With all of this in mind, Bruno saw the annexation of Serbia by the Austro-Hungarian Empire as its final death knell. Even if he managed to prevent the Treaty of Trianon from occurring in this life, as it had in his past, Austro-Hungary, as a political entity, and the Habsburg rule over the Balkans would come to a brutal and bloody end within the coming decades. It was simply inevitable, and inevitability was the strongest magic of all. Thus, despite the tolls extorted upon Serbia for starting this war, or perhaps even because of it, Bruno was not the slightest bit happy with today's events. As he knew, all too soon there would be another war for him to fight. And that was not even the Second World War, which may or may not occur during this timeline, depending on how the result of this great war. No, the coming war would be one to secure the House of Habsburg and perhaps ensure its peaceful unification with the remainder of Germany. But in order for this to become a reality, Bruno would first have to win this current global conflict. And because of that, Bruno made none of his actual thoughts on how Serbia was being treated known to any of the men who could have altered the treaty. He simply ensured that Serbia surrendered. And he had done so to remind the negotiations and the parties present that ultimately, at the end of the day, might was right. One simply could not protest their mistreatment when they started a war they were simply incapable of winning. Chapter 241. Belgium calls for aid. Serbia's surrender came as no surprise to the other nations of the world. They had fought, lost repeatedly in a series of disastrous battles, and were caught between their enemies on both sides. The kingdom immediately became occupied by the Austro-Hungarian army, who would, for the duration of the war, act as gendarmes. As for the remainder of the newly reconstituted Central Powers were concerned, the war in the Balkans had yet to fully end. Montenegro had yet to sue for peace despite being surrounded on all sides by their enemies, while the Ottoman Empire still remained defiant. Montenegro was naturally the first cause for concern, but Bruno believed they would surrender within the week, most likely by the start of the new year. Because of this, he set his eyes on the Ottoman Empire and the lands that they still occupied in Europe. However, invading the Ottoman Empire directly was impossible, as Bulgaria currently owned the lands between them and the Greeks. Having chosen to remain neutral in this conflict, at least for the time being, there was not much possibility of negotiating military access for the sake of attacking the Turks, who were an active member of the Allied powers. Thus, Bruno and his men would have to travel by sea, and gaining the transportation to do so was not a swift task. Hence, for the time being he was stuck in Belgrade, the city whose death he was responsible for. It would take time to repopulate the capital of Serbia, and because of this it was more or less currently a military fortification. But none of that really mattered, as more pressing concerns were being had further north. After months of battle, the Belgian armed forces were on the verge of complete and total capitulation. Thoroughly exhausted by the French onslaught, they had been repeatedly pushed back to their borders on the edge of the German Reich. For whatever reason, the King of Belgium had remained defiant in fighting his own battles, probably because he suspected the Kaiser would attempt to annex his lands by the time this war was over if he allowed the German army to march through and drive the French out, no doubt resulting in the complete and total occupation of Belgium, as the Germans had done to Luxembourg. And while Luxembourg welcomed the German soldiers, especially their young women, Belgium did not wish to do the same. In Bruno's past life, the Royal Belgian Army had been completely overrun by their German counterparts before the winter even began. Yet even now, as the year 1914 came to a close in this new timeline, they still resisted the French invasion with whatever strength they could muster. And King Albert I had been more or less in a similar style of leadership to Bruno, actively leading his soldiers into battle, rather than sitting back from afar in the safety of his capital or any other distant town. It was perhaps because of this that the men beneath his command revered him so. After all, it was a rarity, especially in this modern era, for a monarch to fight his own battles. But even so, the legendary Night King of Belgium had used all of his strength in this fight, and it was now coming to an end. Because of this, he was surrounded by his generals, as they considered what precisely they should do about this situation. It would appear that we have run the course of our resistance. We either flee into exile now and seek refuge among some neutral nation, or we ask the Kaiser to send his army into Belgium, knowing fully well the Germans will not leave our lands until after this war is over, and even then there is a potential for hostile annexation. I, as your king, have done everything in my power to lead you in our defiance of foreign invasion, but I know this is the end. Thus, I must ask you all to lend me not your strength, as you have done so far, but rather your wisdom. To admit defeat and flee into exile, or to open our doors to a pack of wolves so that they may fight the boar which has forced itself into our home. None of these men wanted to admit that they simply lacked the strength and power to defend their own borders from either of their neighbors. And though the Kaiser had warned the Belgians in advance that the French would likely march through their lands to attack Germany from the north, Albert believed this to have been a mere bluff on the Kaiser's part to coerce him into accepting German military access. Even as the Germans constructed fortifications on his borders, and that of the Netherlands above, the Belgian king did not take this warning seriously. Only now did he regret his naivety. Having believed the French were above such reprehensible behavior, King Albert had come to understand that he should have been more proactive in his preparations. Thus he sighed and shook his head, lighting a cigarette and taking a long drag from the sweet poison within as he waited for his generals to come to a consensus. And when they did, he was most certainly surprised by their response. It is of our opinion that we should accept the open invitation for aid that the Kaiser had extended to us, and pray to God in heaven that he won't change the circumstances mentioned within it because we have so recklessly chided him in the first place. With this agreement being made among Belgium's general staff, the king sighed once more while he put out his cigarette and picked up a nearby phone, calling the man who would either be Belgium's savior or its future tyrant. Kaiser Wilhelm II was not the least bit surprised that he had been called upon by the Belgian king during the man's hour of need. In fact, he was most certainly expecting it, hence why after participating in the formal surrender of the Kingdom of Serbia, or what remained of its leadership, he headed back to Berlin with haste. Having only just arrived in his family's home a few hours prior, the Kaiser was alerted by his staff while sitting in his private office of the call, which was waiting for his answer. Naturally, the German emperor accepted the call, which was thoroughly encrypted by German intelligence efforts. And when he did so, he spoke to the king whose lands lay on his northwestern border, with an almost smug tone in his voice. "I'm not going to lie, Albert. I was beginning to expect that you would rather resist until the very end rather than call upon me for my help. Am I really such a dastardly individual that you would not even ask for my aid when you are about to be overrun by a bunch of foreign invaders? Here I thought our friendship was so much more than that. It would appear I was mistaken. You have truly offended me." King Albert rolled his eyes, biting his tongue, as he knew all too well what the Kaiser's personality was like. There was no point making an ass of himself and risk offending the man who was his and his people's last lifeline. Even so, the tone in Albert's voice was most certainly curt as he responded to this statement with an aura of repressed rage. "You already know why I am calling. So let's cut this short as I do not have the time for this right now. What do I need to give you in order to guarantee military assistance from the German Reich and its vast army?" Wilhelm chuckled as he heard this. Apparently, the Belgian king was in a far more precarious position than he was initially led to believe. Even so, the Kaiser did not demand anything from the man that would make him the villain in this situation. France had shot itself in the foot by invading two neutral countries for the sake of attacking German borders between them. Their reputation and that of their allies had been sullied. This was only compounded after the Serbian royal family's involvement in starting the war, among their other crimes, came to light following the massacre of Belgrade. Because of this, Kaiser Wilhelm, and by extent the newly rebranded Central Powers, had gained quite a bit of goodwill on the global stage. He would not squander the good reputation he had acquired by making cruel and unusual demands of a nation in need. Hence why the Kaiser's response was rather bewildering to the Belgian king, who had initially expected him of having far more sinister ulterior motives. "All you ever needed to do was simply ask for my help. I want nothing from you or your people. Publicly announce your entry into the Central Powers as a result of needless French aggression, and my armies will arrive within the hour to save you." It took King Albert II to realize what he was being told, and when he fully comprehended it, he couldn't help but ask the question that immediately surfaced in his mind. "That is it. That is all you require, a public request for aid, and a condemnation of the French Republic for its unwarranted invasion of my lands. Thousands of your men will suffer and die defending my lands. And what precisely do you get out of this?" Though Albert couldn't see it, the Kaiser's lips curled into a petty smirk as he announced what precisely he achieved from this that was worth the price paid. "What do I get out of this? Let me ask you this, Albert. Is simply screwing over the French not enough to pay such a sum?" Wilhelm did not let Albert respond, and immediately hung up the phone. Minutes later, Albert would make his public declaration of his intent to join the Central Powers, as well as his speech thoroughly condemning France, its army, and the Republic altogether for forcing him into such a position. As promised by the Kaiser, within the hour, German troops and their supplies advanced into Belgium, providing support to the brave soldiers of the Royal Belgian Army who were on their last line of defense against a foreign aggressor. The fight for control of Belgium had only just truly begun. Chapter 242. Looking back on the first year of the Great War. Belgium's entry into the war made matters more complicated for the Allies. Initially, this war was seen by many in the world as a tragic response of Austro-Hungarian aggression into Serbia. The late Serbian King Peter I had made it seem like their requests would violate his sovereignty as an independent ruler. However, as more and more hidden secrets were revealed, Serbia and its royal family started becoming the villains from the perspective of those neutral nations which sat by and watched as Europe burned in the background. In addition to this, France's violations of Luxembourgish and Belgian neutrality was seen as a flagrant and aggressive violation done without any potential just cause. At least the Austro-Hungarians had a valid casus belli to declare war on the Serbians. But the French invasions of Belgium and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg represented an era long since believed to have been diminished in the Western world, and an era where might was right, and one could invade their neighbors simply because they had the means to do so. Post-Enlightenment, of which France claimed to be the originator of in at least some capacity, such invasions were seldom to be found, at least among the European powers who believed themselves more civilized than the rest of the world. And to some extent, outside of Asia. That is, this was partially true. Even so, France had violated these international norms, and had done so after repeated defeats at the hands of the Germans when the French army tried to advance through their eastern neighbors' borders. This only made their invasions of Belgium and Luxembourg more fiendish in the eyes of the neutral powers, because it was seen as a desperate attempt, done after repeated humiliating defeats. Had it been a matter of grand strategy enacted on day one of the war, it could be seen as just reprehensible. After all, Germany had done this in their past life, and though much of the world seemed to believe this was an unwarranted act of aggression, there were many others which this did not stop their entry into the war on behalf of the Central Powers. But the dynamic of the aggressors and the defenders had completely swapped in this life, with Germany holding its own ground, and only advance into Luxembourg and Belgium when called upon for aid by the two nations. Instead, France had been the invader, marching into lands that were not their own, suffering from their own inadequacy against a heavily entrenched and technologically superior foe, one which resulted in their continuous and bloody losses. Belgium was no exception to this pattern, as the German army advanced much like they had in Luxembourg, rapidly on the back of armored cars, and with their artillery being pulled by trucks behind them, allowing for the rapid transportation of men, materials, and munitions to support the Royal Belgian Army, who were just about to be overrun. That, however, changed with the arrival of the German soldiers whose armored cars acted as a battering ram against the French lines, while simultaneously providing protection to the infantry in support of them until they managed to cross the otherwise dangerous no-man's land that had been established between the French and Belgian armies. The French army was quickly routed. It was only natural for this to occur. The enemy came with armored vehicles that were damn near indestructible against the weaponry currently in the French army's possession. The OSB models of the Spa-Panzer utilized the E-10 chassis, meaning that they had sloped armor made of rolled homogeneous steel whose plating was 20 millimeters thick at the lightest protected areas and up to 60 millimeters at the heaviest. To put this in perspective, 8x50 mmR Lebel, which was the primary cartridge utilized by the French army in both its bolt-action rifles and its machine guns, was simply not enough to do anything more than scratch the paint job of these armored cars. One would need dedicated anti-tank weapons if they wished to take these armored cars out, and these guns would need to be considerably larger than what the Germans fielded at the end of the Great War to deal with the pitiful tanks of the era. Either that or they would need to land a direct hit with any shell from at the very least a 10 centimeters field gun. But that might not even get the job done, as high explosive shells were not exactly designed with the purpose of taking out armor. Even so, achieving such a precise hit on a target moving with the speed the Spa-Panzer moved with was much easier said than done. And because of this, the French army, who was damn near about to seize the last remnant of Belgium, had broken ranks after their lines were broken through and fled. Yet the German army did not stop there. Belgium was not a small nation like Luxembourg, or at least not nearly as small as the Grand Duchy was. They couldn't simply send a single division to deal with the French. No, they had to send far more troops across multiple battles. At the very least, it would take weeks before the French were fully driven from Belgium. That is assuming they stood and fought, rather than just hightail it back to the French borders. Which, if Bruno was in charge of Belgian campaign, he would bet a substantial amount of money on just that. Either way, the course of the war would be changed one way or another of the course of the next few weeks, depending on how stubbornly the French contested control over Belgium, which they had damn near annexed, if not for German intervention at the last minute. And Bruno, who was currently making his preparations for the invasion of Ottoman Thrace, was more or less paying attention to the Western Front with great interest, as was the rest of the world. After all, it was an era where Europe was the center of the world, and what happened between the great powers affected all others on Earth. Chapter 243, An Ironic Twist of Fate. Leon stood on the edges of the French and Luxembourgish border. Frankly speaking, the German troops in the Grand Duchy had been focusing more on building defenses around the capital, which was the most strategically important region of the minor and neutral European nation. While this gave the French time to rearm and resupply, as well as tend to the wounded, few reinforcements were provided to them. With the losses sustained currently, and their focus being primarily on invading Belgium, what with Luxembourg already being a lost cause. The French Republic only gave Leon a few brigades worth of men to replenish his losses, but no more than that. His orders hold the line no matter what the cost. Once victory in Belgium had been achieved, 250,000 men would be sent to aid him. So, he dug in deep just outside the city. However, time and time again, small raiding parties would harass the French lines, allowing for a greater number of German troops to break into their trenches with minimal effort. The French in Luxembourg had been trounced by stormtroopers armed with semi-automatic trench guns, semi-automatic rifles, automatic submachine guns, and general-purpose machine guns. There was, however, another introduction into Luxembourg that served as the first use of its kind on a battlefield. The German stormtroopers, whose bodies were protected by hardened steel plate armor similar in design to those issued to German soldiers at the end of World War I, came running into the trenches with a terrifying new killing machine. 41 was a man-portable, lightweight flamethrower that Bruno had specifically designed for use in the upcoming Great War in years past. The weapon was modeled after those used by German soldiers during the Second World War of his past life, with one major difference. He introduced napalm as its primary incendiary, though it was capable of using more conventional flames. This was an incredibly nasty thing to do, as napalm, when touching the flesh, could not be put out through normal means, and if one dared to try to pat out the fire, it would spread and burn brighter. The bursts of napalm flame tore through the French trenches by the men who wore Stahlhelms marked with the fabled Totenkopf, not the design from the Second World War, but the one that Bruno had adopted for the Iron Division. Supported by lightweight 60mm mortars from men hiding in no man's land, as well as the overwhelming rate of fire from the MG-34, these stormtroopers obliterated the front lines of the French in the midst of night, without any need for an armored column to advance before them. Once the French soldiers had either been killed or charred into dust, an entire brigade of German infantry would advance through the choke point the stormtroopers created, thoroughly breaking the French lines until they were forced to retreat, leaving behind artillery and machine guns as they fled further back. The result of these repeated skirmishes that turned into significant retreats was that even Leon, a general who refused to get his hands dirty, was covered in mud, oil, and blood, some of it his own, after being personally shot by an MP-34 machine gun in the arm. He was lucky it was just a flesh wound, but even so, the man demanded himself sea treatment above all others. It didn't matter if there were men beneath his command who were far more grievously wounded than he was. He was the fucking general, and thus he received priority, god damn it. Or such was Leon's mentality, as a medic treated his flesh wound with a less than pleased expression on his face. All the while, Leon vented his frustration on the men fighting beneath his orders, having perceived their repeated retreats as an act of the utmost cowardice. Time and again the enemy crosses into our trenches in the dead of night, and massacre our men while they sleep. I want to know who has been on watch for this past month, because if they're not already dead, they soon will be. Leon's words were not exactly welcome among his soldiers. These men had quite literally just faced down an advance of hellfire and mask-wearing demons, who seemingly came out at the witch's hour to personally take their souls. Mortars were not like artillery. Their launch was not exactly something that crackled with the horizon when fired. They were subsonic launches and had ranges that could be fired from far enough away without really being heard by their victims. In the dead of night, located within the midst of no man's land, Such weapons could be used to launch precise and deadly attacks on French munition stockpiles, triggering bigger explosions and causing widespread panic before the assault truly began. And this was exactly how the German stormtroopers had been using their 60mm mortars in Luxembourg. It had eaten away at the morale of the French soldiers time and again. And now that they had to hear their general bitch at them for his failures, they were starting to reach a breaking point. This was evident by the harrowed looks on the men who stood there listening to Leon launch verbal abuse at them in some of the worst ways imaginable, questioning their honor and their manhood as they had rather valiantly defended their positions against a superior enemy. As the medic who was treating Leon heard the French general's ongoing denigration of his soldiers, he shook his head and sighed. That is until another medic ran up to him and whispered something in his ears. The look on the first medic's face turned grim, and perhaps even spiteful, as he nodded towards the fellow medic who ran off. Leon, however, was far too obsessed with chastising his men and their failures as men and as soldiers to notice the rather concerning look on the medic who was treating him. He didn't even notice the man reach into his bag and pull out a syringe, which he injected straight into Leon's veins. This sudden and unexpected action quickly prompted a response by Leon, who yelled at the medic for jabbing a needle into his arm without any warning. "What the hell do you think you are doing? Are you even a properly certified medic?" The medic simply scoffed as he cleaned up what remained of Leon's wound, assuring the man that it was nothing to be so angered over. "Relax, sir. It was simply something to dull the pain." Leon, however, did not feel the drug take effect, and instead began to complain about how poor of a job the medic and all of his men were doing. "Honestly, it's just like you lot to be so fucking incompetent at your jobs. If you would all just listen and obey my orders, we would have won this war by now. But instead you're all a bunch of filthy cow." Leon's words fell short, as he noticed he no longer had the means to speak his mind, no matter how nonsensical his drivel was. He looked over at the medic, who stood up and only now realized the hatred in the man's eyes as he walked away. The medic nodded towards the other soldiers, who had for too long bore the burden of Leon's incompetence and rotten personality. However, just as the medic was about to turn away so that he would not have to gaze upon the gruesome affair that was about to occur, he left behind some final words. "You really should have treated your men with more respect, General. You see, your incompetence is one thing, but your selfishness is another entirely. I just received word that my brother died because you decided to prioritize the treatment of your flesh wound over that of far more seriously injured soldiers beneath your command. Soldiers who had fought valiantly to hold the line in this miserable failure of a campaign you have led us into." After saying this, the medic walked off as the bloodied and bruised French veterans pulled out their trench clubs and began to menacingly approach Leon's paralyzed body on the ground. As much as the man wanted to scream for help, he could not do so, nor could he utter a single sound of agony as he was brutally beaten to death by the men beneath his command to a state so unrecognizable it could be claimed he was killed by German artillery. And Leon, despite his drug-induced paralysis, felt every single ounce of pain dealt to him by the men he had utterly failed, thus ending the incompetent French general and would-be Marxist revolutionary's role in this war before it ever truly began. It was truly an ironic and fitting end for Leon, as a man who had spent his entire life professing himself to be fighting for the good of the common man. It was those same very men who ended up taking his life in the most brutal fashion possible. Chapter 244, Contemplating Mortality and God's Will in the World. To say that Bruno was not the least bit concerned with Leon's death, which was revealed in the papers as an act of German artillery, was quite the understatement. If not for the fact that French propaganda had painted the failed general as Bruno's rival on the world stage, he would have forgotten all about the man. Leon had not earned his position. He was given it because of Bruno's rapid rise. They needed a young face among the general staff, one with a good service record as an officer, and Leon's shared history with Bruno in the East gave him preference in this regard. However, the man had proven to be volatile, quick to anger, extremely selfish, short-sighted, and incompetent on a scale larger than the command of a battalion, especially when given his own theater, albeit a minor one like Luxembourg, to plot and invade on his own, the result of which was his death at the hands of his own men. who concealed this act of murder and mutiny as a random casualty of the war. In the end, Bruno had nearly forgotten about Leon, and any grievances against him and the French general was merely a one-sided affair. Bruno simply didn't care. Leon's death had no real impact on the war, and he was a figure from his past life that was unknown to history, meaning he was incredibly unlikely to leave a real footprint on the world after the Great War was over. No, Bruno was far more interested in important French figures of the era, like Charles de Gaulle, who, ironically enough, was currently serving in Belgium as a much lower-ranking officer than Leon had been at the time of the man's death. Charles de Gaulle was currently a lieutenant in the 33rd Infantry Regiment, which according to Bruno's intelligence was receiving a severe pounding from the Belgian-German alliance that they were defending against, as Bruno himself currently sipped from a cup of coffee within the city of Belgrade and read from the daily newspaper. In Bruno's past life, the man had been a major player in shaping the world during and after WW2. Though from 1916 until 1918, he was a prisoner of war in the previous timeline, only reaching the rank of captain by the time he was captured. Whether Charles would live or die was up to fate to decide. Even so, Bruno couldn't help but feel that there was something that didn't sit right with Leon's sudden death. According to his intelligence, the only artillery employed in the battle were lightweight 60mm mortars which had been used by the stormtroopers in their assault. If rumors were to be believed, Leon's death was so gruesome, Bruno would find it hard to believe that a mere 60mm mortar shell had taken him out in such a fashion. Luxembourg was not his area of responsibility, however, and because of this, gathering accurate information on the topic was a more difficult endeavor than he cared to actually pursue. Because of this, he eventually put down his paper and sighed as he pulled out a cigarette from his pack of smokes. He was just about to light the thing when Heinrich sat down in front of him. The man had his own medals pinned to his chest, which he had earned over the years, and was quick to comment on the paper Bruno was just reading, with a grim look on his face. You know that could be either of us, right? Before this war ends, the angels could come calling for you or me just as they did that French twat. Bruno chuckled as he heard this, before responding to his friend's somber tone, as he tossed the paper aside so that neither of them dwelled on the morbid subject for too long. I hate to break it to you, Heinrich, but I am far too important for the plans God has for this world. If I am stupid enough to get myself killed before I have finished his work, our Heavenly Father will simply send me back to attempt it again. Heinrich chuckled at Bruno's words. The man had indeed grown more religious as the years passed, but this was perhaps the most insufferable cope he had ever heard Bruno state regarding his own mortality and the potential of his death in the line of duty. Because of this, there was almost a bittersweet smirk on the colonel's face as he responded to what he perceived to be a jest from his superior officer. Are you sure about that, my friend? How certain are you that when you die, the Lord will just send you back to start anew? Wouldn't your failure to achieve the goals he had trusted you with mean that you are unworthy of resurrection? Bruno's expression turned mortified as he heard his friend's words, not only because he knew there was some truth to them, but also because he found it to be amusing. Dear God, I never thought of it that way before, but you might actually be right. The amount of stupid shit I have done on the battlefield because I assumed my death would not be final. I think I want to go home and rethink my life. At first, Heinrich thought that Bruno had been joking around this entire time, but the man's acting skills were convincing enough in this moment that he genuinely thought the man may have had a complete and total delusional mindset throughout his entire military career until now, causing Heinrich to jump out of his seat and shout at his friend as if the man was an absolute idiot. Are you fucking kidding me? His reaction was loud and stirring enough that the interests of several soldiers sitting nearby were cast upon the two high-ranking officers, that is until they realized who they were. Bruno, however, simply chuckled and shook his head while returning to his coffee, all with a cheerful smile on his face. Relax, Heinrich. I may be religious, but I'm not insane. You do know that reincarnation is a Buddhist ideal, right? Not a Christian one. Granted, if God truly exists as the good book claims he does, he most certainly possesses the power to make such a thing reality, but I doubt he would move his hands to help me should I fail so miserably after the second chance he has given me with this life. Heinrich immediately settled himself down, forcibly so as he sat down in his seat, pondering upon Bruno's words. He didn't exactly know what second chance Bruno had spoken about, but after thinking upon it for no more than 5 seconds, he figured it could have been a great deal of things, as Bruno had endured several near-death experiences so far in his relatively young life. Instead, he sighed heavily, before assuring Bruno he was serious with the deliberate tone in his voice, while expressing his gravest concern about this war. "Hey man, seriously though, promise me, if I end up dying out here, you will take good care of Aya, right? You will look after my daughter for me, yes?" Bruno smirked, seeing this as a good chance to make fun of his friend, despite the severity of the request, as he looked Heinrich straight in the eyes while sipping his coffee once more before saying the words he knew would utterly infuriate the man. "Relax, the matter is settled. She is already set to marry my eldest son. What more can I do than that?" Heinrich, of course, grew flustered as he stood up once more and cursed at Bruno before storming off in a fit of rage. "Fuck you. I never consented to that fucking engagement, and you know it." As Heinrich pouted and angrily stomped away from Bruno, the man hollered at his friend once more, doing his best to thoroughly take advantage of the situation given to him. "What? You don't want to be a member of my family? I am insulted. To think that for all these years, I thought we were as close as brothers." If it were not for the fact that Bruno was at the peak of German military command, and the city was filled with soldiers at the moment, Heinrich would have flipped off Bruno as he walked away from his line of sight. But he reserved himself because of the circumstances, even if it pained him to do so. Chapter 245, a long-forgotten offer finally accepted. Bruno's predictions had more or less come true, especially in regards to Nikola Tesla. Fearing the idea of leaving the land of opportunity, which was the United States, behind, especially in this booming era of free enterprise in the region. The genius inventor had declined to initially accept Bruno's invitation to move to the German Reich and work for him. Despite Bruno acquiring many of the era's greatest inventors, Tesla remained firm in his decision. But as Bruno also expected, nobody else was really willing to invest in his ideas that were just not profitable from the perspective of businessmen who could not grasp the bigger picture of Tesla's brilliance and what it meant for the world and humanity as a whole. Money began to dry up very quickly, and when the war broke out, that only further became a matter of complication, as U.S. companies began to infringe on his patents, or at least those that were still giving him some monetary compensation. The United States of America had entered a state of fervent isolationism, and this allowed them to justify ripping off patents from major European powers involved in the war by stating they had no intention of aiding either side with compensation. This, of course, caused many issues in society as the United States began to pursue a path of self-sufficiency, both economically and military, reinforcing the Monroe Doctrine and more or less isolating itself from global trade out of fear of provoking both major alliances within the ongoing Great War. In the long term, this newfound desire for autarky and the importance which the United States government put upon it had many benefits for the American nation and its people. But in the short term, it would also cause problems for the economy as a whole. And unfortunately for Tesla, who was already financially unstable, he had been a victim of these major consequences in ways that damn near rendered him homeless and bankrupt, having few options left, as his attempts to legally compel companies to obey international trade regulations, such as financial compensation for his patents filed abroad, had all but failed. The man was in the middle of packing up what few belongings he had left, as he was rather frantically trying to escape a hotel room which he had been living in for the past week, but had yet to pay for. Soon, the time upon him would be to do just that, and he could not afford to do so. And as Tesla did so, the most coincidental thing occurred. The card which Bruno had given the man nearly a decade ago, one which had various means to contact the German general and titan of industry, fell out of one of his old coats. A coat he had not worn in years, but was the only thing currently keeping the cold of winter in New York City from eating him alive. At first, Tesla did not notice the card which fell out of his pocket and onto the floor, that is until the knock on the door had startled him into tripping over one of his shirts which was hewn aside, causing to fall face first in front of the small device. The shout at the door, which came from the angry manager who was demanding payment which had long since been past due, was just enough to awake Tesla from the stupor he had temporarily entered upon hitting his jaw on the floor. and when he opened his eyes, he saw the name on top of the card, forcing the man to remember the offer Bruno had made him many years ago. An offer Bruno had said was in perpetuity. He had messed up, run out of time, and was now incapable of escaping the hotel room without payment. Payment he could not provide. As a result, he quickly opened the door, with a rather frantic gaze, and stared the hotel manager in the eyes, desperately asking for one thing as he assured the man he would be properly compensated for all the time that had been spent occupying the room. I need to use your phone. If you allow this, I promise you, I will pay you in full, and will even give you a nice tip for your generosity in this matter so far. As much as the hotel manager considered Tesla to be a shifty character, one who might try to swindle him out of what he was due, the man ultimately was swayed by the confidence in Tesla's eyes and tone, as well as the man's natural charisma, or whatever he had managed to pull out of the depths of his soul in that very moment of need. In Bruno's past life, the first transatlantic phone call had occurred in 1927, over a decade from the current year. However, due to the last decade being heavily influenced across the world by Bruno's substantial investment into the world's greatest scientific minds, as well as global trade and communication methods, Tesla was able to call across the Atlantic and to the nation of Germany. Tesla just so happened to be calling at the exact hour of the day to make it into contact with a woman in Berlin who was nearing the end of her shift. A woman who worked for Bruno, and when she heard exactly who was calling, her eyes opened wide, before a smug smirk appeared across her face. "Mr. Tesla, my employer has been waiting for your call for the better part of a decade now. With that being said, he has made sure that someone stays here at this phone during every hour of the day in case you were specifically to call us. While Mr. von Zehntner is currently away performing his duties as general in the war, he has given me full authority to assure you that his offer still stands as he gave it to you all those years ago, and that any expenses needed to secure your move to Berlin will be paid in full whenever you require it by the company. Shall I assume this call of yours is your agreement to come work for my employer?" As much as Tesla did not want to admit it, there was not much left for him within the United States to continue struggling for. Bruno's offer, he had always thought, was simply too good to be true. Yet, if this woman wasn't lying to him, he had paid round-the-clock employees to do one simple thing, and that was to maintain a careful vigil over the phone in case he called at any hour of the day. And Bruno had done so for the better part of 10 years. In addition to this, the offer still stood, and Bruno was willing to financially compensate the man for his move to the German Reich. Even if things did smoothen themselves out here in the United States, he was between a rock and a hard place at the moment. Being given a lifeline in his moment of need, when nobody else would do so, was more than enough to convince the genius inventor to finally accept Bruno's offer. After which he managed to negotiate the transfer of funds necessary to pay the hotel for his stay and his safe passage to Berlin. How exactly he managed to swing such a thing would be lost to history. But in the end, Nikola Tesla moved to Berlin to work for Bruno, that much was certain. Chapter 246, Planning for the Gallipoli Campaign. Bruno would gather daily with the fellow leaders of the army groups sent to the Balkan campaign. At the same time, Montenegro, as expected, fell by the wayside. With Serbia out of the war and being surrounded by a technologically superior army numbered over tenfold their own forces, the small kingdom admitted defeat before the final battle had been waged. In the span of a single season, the two greatest concerns of the Balkans had been taken out with swift and decisive action. Now all that remained was the Ottoman Empire, and it had been a thorn in Europe's side for far, far too long. And Bruno would bring a brutal end to its regime, and in doing so, would allow Greece to reclaim its historical and disputed territories. Bruno planned to be so thorough in his victory that not a single Turk would remain in the lands of Thrace, Ionia, Cyprus, the Dodecanese Islands, and Crete. So long as a single Turk occupied these lands, they would forever be disputed. While simply killing the people in these regions was the most logical and practical solution available to Bruno and the Central Powers, Bruno did not believe that harming innocent and unarmed people was a proper thing to do. Instead, he would follow the Allied powers' examples on how they destroyed German claims over its historical and ancestral lands following their defeat in the Second World War of his past life. Forceful relocation eastward into Anatolia. The resources needed to acquire such a thing would be vast, and Bruno could not accomplish this goal during the war, but following a Central Powers victory, which was Bruno's ultimate goal in this life, he figured this reclamation of Greater Greece could truly be established. Thus, at the moment Bruno was speaking of his plans to his allies as they smoked a cigarette to calm his nerves. Transport ships will have to be allocated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire to accomplish our aims. There is simply no feasible reality where the High Seas Fleet can accommodate an escort at this moment, which will guarantee their safe travel from the North Sea and into the Eastern Mediterranean. As for the Black Seas Fleet, until the Bosphorus and Dardanelles can be secured for our own forces, it is starting to look like the Russians will be unable to provide aid. It is because of this, I believe we should currently use our combined assets to assault this fortress here, unblocking access to our fleets to the Dardanelles Strait. Bruno pointed to an area of the map any student of history would immediately recognize: the Gallipoli Peninsula. It was definitely an eye-opening gesture as the Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Greek generals tensed up while straightening their backs after hearing Bruno's suggestions on how to begin their invasion of the Ottoman Empire. The Russian general among their ranks was quick to comment on the overwhelming cost of life that would be spent seizing such a fortified objective should they march upon Gallipoli. You do realize if we try to launch an amphibious landing, thousands of our men will die to take the peninsula, right? Bruno scoffed as he reached into his greatcoat's inner pocket with his spare hand and pulled out his flask, quickly popping off the lid with the same hand before taking a swig. After doing so, he stashed the flask away while taking a drag from his cigarette. The harrowing look on his face as he spoke made it abundantly clear that he was all too aware of what price was about to be made to seize the Dardanelles Strait, and that he lamented the thought of the overwhelming loss of life that would occur. Tens of thousands, at the very least. Nevertheless, wars are not won without casualties. That is the price of victory. And to win this war, we need to liberate the Black Sea Fleet from their isolation beyond the Bosphorus. It will require time to muster the transports needed to prepare for the ultimate goal, being the siege of Constantinople, which would be far less costly with the aid of the Russian Navy on our side. Unfortunately, in order to get to the Bosphorus Strait, we must first seize Gallipoli. I'm going to make something abundantly clear to you all right now. Neither I nor the men beneath my command are properly trained in the art of naval landings, nor do we have the appropriate equipment to do so. We are soldiers, not Marines. Nevertheless, we will be right there with you all in the thick of it when the time to begin the Gallipoli campaign begins. In fact, I dare say we will probably sustain the highest rate of casualties, as my soldiers will be leading the vanguard as usual. Now, with all of this being said, you do not need to fret too much to the point of suffering an anxiety attack. It will take time to prepare the resources necessary to invade our next objective. And the Ottomans at the moment are more or less isolated within their own territory, focusing on defending eastern Anatolia from the advance of our forces in the region. By midsummer of this year at the latest, we will begin our invasion of Gallipoli. As I am sure we can all agree that rushing ourselves into a new campaign after having just emerged victorious here in Serbia and Montenegro could prove to be far more costly than any of us desire. We are in an extremely advantageous position at the moment where none of our nations have lost any significant ground in this conflict, while our enemies are pressed on all sides. We can take half a year to make the preparations necessary to ensure the least amount of casualties possible when we decide to pursue a finishing blow to the Turks and their damned caliphate once and for all. There was damn near a collective sigh of relief among those present when they realized Bruno did not plan to hastily advance upon the Dardanelles. As for the preparations that would need to be made for the war, Bruno had long since begun producing them. There was just one problem. He would need to find a way to transfer the landing craft in mind from the Baltic and North Seas to the Mediterranean. Chapter 247. Returning to the Fatherland. Bruno had more luxuries than the men beneath his command. He was the highest rank a man could achieve in the German army. Traveling from the front lines back to Berlin was not only a matter of personal luxury, but oftentimes necessity. As Montenegro and Serbia both capitulated, and the troops which Bruno was in charge of largely began gendarme operations while also simultaneously preparing for a war in a new theater, Bruno found himself with little to actually do. In fact, his expertise was actually needed back in the fatherland. checking to see if the preparations he had made in years past had finally been concluded. For the most part, Bruno's involvement in creating military designs, taken, modified, and improved from his past life, had been focused on the army, as that was more or less the single most important part of the Great War, and was also his primary means of production. But there were a few naval vessels Bruno had introduced to the world. Two were well known by now and had played a major role in the German Kaiserliche Marine's dominance over the seas. And that was both the Type XXI U-boats, or at least the improved variant which Bruno introduced in this life, and the WW2-era destroyers, which escorted German commercial vessels, troop transports, and even accompanied larger fleets into battle. These two types of naval ships had proven, time and again, their worth. But there was a third invention Bruno had developed in secrecy, as gaining approval for use by the Navy had proven to be difficult. In times past, naval infantry or Marines had more or less been limited. The reality was that contested battles on the shores were rare in history, and because of this, the idea of spending the taxpayers' money to fund a fleet of landing craft designed for this very purpose was something that Bruno simply could not get approved no matter how hard he tried. But there was not exactly a law preventing private ownership of such vessels, perhaps even a fleet of them. After all, without weapons on board, landing craft were more or less no different from civilian ships. With that said, weapons that could be mounted would be small-scale and easily retrofitted onto the ships, if need be, at most 37mm autocannons. Because of this, Bruno decided to return to the German Reich to ensure that his fleet of automobile transport vessels was fully constructed and ready to set sail. Yes, Bruno had shamelessly concealed the construction, commission, and ownership of naval landing craft as mere cargo ships designed to carry exclusively automobiles in large numbers. The reality was these ships could carry both men and armored vehicles on board. But nobody had ever really heard of such a thing, let alone expected these ships for such a unique purpose. After all, until now, naval infantry had more often than not deployed via small wooden rowboats, which were easily mowed down by modern defenses. And even then, they usually did so without having an actual fight in mind when they reached the shores. I mean, the idea of a billionaire with exceptional ties to the military would go out of his way to circumvent naval procurement channels via the private funding, construction, and commission of a personal fleet of dedicated landing craft was an absurd idea, to say the least. Because of this, nobody really expected such a move, whether that be the German politicians or the enemies of the Reich. Thus, when Bruno arrived in his primary naval shipyards in Hamburg to check on the progress of his little side project, he was not the least bit surprised to see that there were dozens of ships in this single port waiting for him. The engineers at Bruno's Naval Arms Manufacturing Company were quite happy to see their employer visiting, as the man in charge walked Bruno around the docks and explained how the ships had been perfected. As you can see here, the armor plating on these landing craft is thick enough to stop even a 37mm pom-pom from penetrating its armor. Although, if struck directly by artillery, it could prove troublesome. As for the ships in question, they can carry about 2 panzers each, or 200 men, depending on whether you are focused on armor or infantry. They have a range of approximately 350 kilometers with a speed of 17 kilometers per hour fully loaded. In addition to this, these ships can be quickly retrofitted with either a 20mm or 37mm autocannon that can be utilized as both anti-personnel or anti-air defense. Due to the limited range, we have made modifications available to existing warships to allow their carry. As of right now, we have roughly 150 of these landing craft fully manufactured and awaiting deployment as you see fit. All we will need is parliamentary approval to mount their armament and begin shipping them off to the Kaiserliche Marine for deployment. Bruno had initially designed the ships on the LCM-8 from the Vietnam War of his past life. They were more or less an improvement upon existing designs used by the United States Marine Corps during the Second World War a few decades earlier. These ships continued to see service into the 21st century as well among a variety of the world's naval forces due to how efficient they were. And now that they were completed in this life a few decades prior than they should have been, Bruno could see why. One of the monumental failures of the Allies in his past life when they invaded Gallipoli was the fact that they were on vessels that were easily blown out of the water. Many men died before they ever reached the shores. But with these landing craft in place, that was not a worry. Because of this, Bruno patted the shoulder of the lead engineer of his Naval Arms Corporation and congratulated him on his achievement. It is perfect as far as I can see. Make no mistake, convincing the Naval Board of Procurement to immediately authorize the use of these landing craft for the campaign I have planned will be an easy matter. You have no idea how many of our soldiers you have saved by bringing my vision into reality. Everyone who has made this a reality can expect a major bonus this year for their efforts. Bruno's words were most welcomed by not only the man he was speaking to, but all the employees at the shipyard. They may not be fighting on the battlefield, but logistics won wars, and producing military equipment was no easy task. To be rewarded with a generous bonus was most certainly welcome news, and would no doubt add to their motivation to continue their great work going forward. Chapter 248. A brief return to the family estate. While the first stop on his brief visit to the fatherland was the shipyards in Hamburg, Bruno made sure to make his way home after business had been concluded. The introduction of his new landing craft could ensure minimal casualties were spent gaining control over Gallipoli, a campaign that in his past life had been utterly disastrous for the Allied forces that landed in the peninsula. And while his people worked behind the scenes to get the vehicles adopted by the Kaiserliche Marine, Bruno had very little to do with his time, and thus returned to Berlin for a brief visit to his wife and children. Heidi, having contacts in military intelligence, was all too aware that her husband was coming home, and thus made sure herself and the children were presentable outside the doors of their home as they waited in the courtyard for the arrival of the head of their house. She was wearing a rather lavish dress, with both of her chivalric orders pinned on her dress. The Order of Lausy was pinned just below her right breast, while the Bavarian Order of St. Elizabeth was pinned on the shoulder hem of her lavish gown. Alia was standing next to her fiancé, which was Bruno's eldest son Erwin, while his older and younger sisters stood by their sides. In addition to this, the younger children were properly groomed and dressed for the rare occasion of their father returning from the front lines for a brief period of rest and respite. When the motorcade pulled into the grounds of Bruno's rather exceptional estate, a group of armed soldiers opened the doors for the German general who stepped out of the back of the car he was sitting in. Bruno himself was wearing his full dress uniform, with his rank, medals, and other distinguished badges and cords on full display. When he saw his wife and kids waiting for him, the man broke out into a smile as he stepped forward and hugged his wife, kissing her on the lips in a romantic gesture before commenting on her beauty, and more specifically, her newest award. My, has my little angel been awarded for her charitable acts? You look absolutely ravishing, darling. Naturally, being surrounded by nothing but men for months at a time on the battlefield made Bruno more than aroused the moment he saw his wife and her all-perfection on display for him. Heidi was quick to remind Bruno that their children were present and that any further attempts to be intimate with her so openly would be nothing short of inappropriate. My love, our children are present. You should mind your surroundings before being so flirtatious in the future. Bruno couldn't help but scoff as he turned to his eldest daughter, Eva, who was growing like a weed, and quickly hugged her, the girl damn near in tears as she greeted her father, who had returned home to her safe and sound. Daddy, thank God you are safe. I have heard stories about the brothers and fathers of my friends. They. Before she could finish her statement, Bruno placed a finger to his young daughter's lips and shook his head, instantly silencing the girl on the spot, while assuring her he would never end up in such a miserable state. Relax, sweetheart, your father is not like those men. God is on his side, and until the day the Lord calls me to him, I will remain unharmed. Eva swallowed whatever worries she was about to express and simply continued to hug her father, as the man himself desperately tried to pry himself away from his child, who was latched to him as if she were a lamprey. Ultimately, Erwin managed to pull his elder sister aside and chastise her before greeting his father, the man of the house, and welcoming his return. Get a hold of yourself, Eva. Father has been gone for roughly half a year, and yet you're acting as if he has been gone for all of your life. Father, it is a relief to see you home, safe and sound. Though I trust you will not be around for long, not with the war being waged as we speak. There was a look of longing in the teenage boy's eyes, as if he personally wanted to pick up a rifle and fight in defense of the fatherland's untarnished honor. Bruno, of course, was quick to remind his son that he was far too young, and not to get any ideas, as there were more than a few schoolboys who were stupid enough to go to the trenches, whether in this life or the previous one he had come from. Don't get any ideas, boy. You are far too young to go fight, and I would have you immediately return to your mother if you ever attempted such a damned foolish thing. Besides, if you got yourself killed, how the hell would I continue to bully your fiancé's father? He is dreading the idea of handing off his little girl to a brat like you. Alia rolled her eyes and sighed when she heard of her father's continued immaturity, but she also shook her head and face-bombed after hearing that Bruno was behaving just as childishly in his taunts of her father. She, however, was the only one to dread such an idea, as Heidi and her daughters found it humorous. Bruno couldn't help but chastise his soon-to-be daughter-in-law when she saw her behavior. Alia, I know you grew up quickly because of the war in Russia, but you are never too old to have fun, especially at a friend's expense. You should enjoy the small things in life, because if you don't, your face will age as quickly as your mind, and your future husband will come to dread such a thing. This comment caused Alia to become both flustered and self-conscious as she pulled out a hand mirror from her purse and silently inspected her face for potential imperfections caused by stress and age, whereas Heidi was quick to assure the girl that she was fine. All the while, Bruno spoke with the rest of his sons and daughters, greeting each and every one with a loving gesture before walking inside their home together. Despite his sons all wanting to hear their father's war stories, Bruno would not speak of his time at war while he was at home. Reliving such an experience was the last thing he needed now that he finally had some peace in this world. It had been years since Bruno had seen combat, and now that he had done so again, some of his old quirks began to re-manifest themselves, which was something that Heidi most certainly took notice of, even if she did not mention it throughout the day. Ultimately, his time in Germany would be short, no longer than a fortnight before the need to deploy back to the Balkans emerged. There was one threat in the region which Bruno had underestimated, and the chaos of the small country was about to spill over into its neighbors. Chapter 249, God Will Know His Own. In Europe, there were more or less 4 regions that were majority Muslim. Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was currently under Austro-Hungarian control, Kosovo, which had been under Serbian control until its occupation by Austro-Hungary and its eventual surrender a week or 2 prior to Bruno's arrival in Germany. There was also the European parts of the Ottoman Empire, mainly Eastern Thrace, that were currently a Muslim majority. And finally, there was the independent Principality of Albania, which at this time was in a state of total anarchy after its German prince abdicated the throne upon the start of the war. His reasons for doing so were simple. Surrounded on all sides by hostile powers, he felt it was better to flee with his life than wait to be invaded. Because of this, Albania was now enduring a lawless chaos, with multiple factions fighting in all areas of the small Balkan country for control over the land. So just another day in the Balkans, right? Ethnic and religious violence had been a part of the region since the Ottoman Turks first took over and began forcefully converting the natives or suppressing those who refused. However, times were changing, and for the first time in nearly half a millennium, it was starting to look like the Muslims would once and for all be driven out of Europe, or as it had been known in previous centuries, Christendom. Because of this, Christian militias were engaging in all sorts of heinous acts against the Muslim majority within Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Albania. There was simply one objective, either their forceful relocation or their extermination. And there were more than a few Christian powers in the regions with serious grudges against these Muslim populations, ones that had lasted for centuries. These nations were more than willing to arm, train, and provide safe houses for the ultra-Christian paramilitary organizations. With every act of violence committed against the Muslims in these lands, there was, of course, retaliation, sparking a large guerrilla campaign between various factions. One that originated in Albania and quickly began to turn the entire region into a powder keg that was about to explode. Bruno had at most 2 weeks with his family before being recalled to the Balkans, where he found an explosion had recently been detonated in Austro-Hungarian Sarajevo. The explosion was the result of ethnic violence between Bosnian Serb Christians and Bosniak Muslims. Both German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers rushed to the scene, engaging in a firefight with the paramilitary organization responsible for the attack, which this time around just so happened to the Bosniak jihadists. Shouts in what Bruno presumed was the local language were exchanged by the militants, who were eventually gunned down by a combination of rifle and machine gun fire by the soldiers who surrounded them. Eventually, their bodies were dragged out of the building they were barricaded in and tossed into the streets by the German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers, prompting Bruno to inquire about exactly what had happened here. I leave the region for 2 fucking weeks, and all of a sudden, I find myself involved in a campaign against religious militants of both Orthodox and Muslim variety. Can somebody please explain to me just what the fucking hell happened while I was away? It was no surprise that the men who had led the stormtroopers into the heavily barricaded hotel, which had been captured by the Islamic militants, was none other than Eric, who emerged from the scene of his bloodshed while cleaning his bayonet with a cloth. The man had a rather sadistic smirk on his face as he explained exactly what had happened while Bruno was away before anyone else in the vicinity could. Just some usually foolishness in the Balkans. What else did you expect? Alania is in a state of anarchy, allowing for opportunistic groups to fight for control. The violence rapidly became religious and ethnic in nature, as is always the case in this god-forsaken region of the world. Naturally, as Bulgaria and the Ottomans began supplying each faction, it spilled over into our territory. Fucking Christ, is this a shit show? These bastards attack and then run away to hide among the civilians. Honestly, I think we should just level the region altogether. That way we can deal with these fucking Muslim bastards and for all. If you ask me, they have occupied Christian lands for far too long, and now that we have the chance to do something about it, we should. Bruno immediately felt compelled to smoke upon hearing his friend and subordinate not so subtly suggest an act of genocide. But strangely enough, he did not do so. Instead, he began to soothe the bridge of his nose as if trying desperately to fight off an oncoming migraine before eventually responding to Eric's suggestion with an almost hostile tone. Even if I agreed with your so-called solution, which, for the record, I do not, you do understand that there are still thousands of Christians in this city. How exactly do you intend to tell the difference between assuming I were to actually entertain your ideas of genocide? Eric's next words were chilling, and something that Bruno would probably remember for the rest of his life, as he swore he had read them before in history. We don't. Kill them all. God will know his own. Bruno could tell that it was not just Eric who shared this sentiment. There were plenty of men, especially among the Austro-Hungarian soldiers who surrounded them, that agreed with this statement entirely. The time had come to reclaim the last vestige of Christendom from the hands of the Muslim occupiers, and many of these men, especially those who came from the Balkans and not Germanic Europe, deeply resonated with the words Eric had spoken. Eric, of course, not exactly being a fanatic in his own right, but simply having a desire to spill blood, no matter whose it was simply trying to latch onto a convenient chance to do just this. Bruno might be cruel towards his enemies, and more than willing to disregard collateral damage such as civilian casualties in pursuit of victory, was at the end of the day not a sadistic psychopath or a genocidal maniac. Because of this, he couldn't help but condemn Eric in the harshest of terms, and openly of that, as he refused the idea outright, and instead began plotting on how to deal with both the Muslim and Orthodox militants who were using their religions as an excuse to engage in violence, much in the same way Eric had wanted to do so. There is no reality on this earth where I even possibly entertain the horrific thoughts you have just tried to put into my mind. If it weren't the fact that you were damn good at your job, I would have you court-martialed for even suggesting such a thing. But, since it was merely a verbal exchange, and not an actual crime committed, I will merely resort to withdrawing you from this guerrilla campaign, and instead will send you back to the fatherland on temporary leave. Do not ever suggest openly or privately such a wicked sentiment, whether in my presence or not ever again. For if I ever hear word that you have, you will not be forgiven a third time. Do you understand me, Colonel von Humboldt? Eric seemed to be silently seething at his punishment, having not expected his friend to reprimand him in such a way. But ultimately, he kept his thoughts to himself as he saluted Bruno and accepted his punishment before doing as he was commanded. As for Bruno, he eventually pulled out a cigarette and smoked it, shaking his head as he watched Eric walk away from him with his shoulders rolled in a way that hinted aggressive thoughts. He couldn't help but think that before this war was over, he was going to have to put a bullet in the skull of a man he considered to be among his closest friends. Chapter 250, discussing the Albania question. The chaos of Albania spilling into the rest of the Balkans was a nightmare situation become reality, and Bruno did not know how he was going to contain the fire that was rapidly spreading throughout the region. It wasn't exactly a surprise that this was happening. In fact, it was highly expected, if not outright inevitable, though Bruno was caught a bit off guard with the timing. Austro-Hungary's collapse was inevitable. All civilizations crumbled eventually, and all species reached a point of extinction. Time had a way of bringing all that existed in this universe to utter ruin. But Austro-Hungary's collapse was destined to be far quicker and more brutal than most stable empires. The reason being was simple. Different religions, cultures, and ethnicities could not inhabit the same lands for long before they began to fight over control of it. Forcing the various identities in the Balkans to live beneath the same banner was a bad idea to begin with, but far more so when they were being ruled over by a foreign monarch. A German ruling over an empire primarily built in the Balkans? Apparently, the inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty had a far greater long-term effect on their gene pool than the mathematic equation would otherwise suggest. It was honestly the only explanation Bruno could rationalize as to why Francis I had decided to maintain control over his holdings in the Balkans when he dismantled the Holy Roman Empire as a political entity. What else could possibly be used to explain such a reckless idea? Building an empire on loose sand in front of a crashing tidal wave was not exactly conducive to long-term stability. Now, was it? It was pride, wasn't it? The damn pride of a man who refused to give up his recognition as an emperor. Pride really was the root of all evil in this world. This was the only conclusion Bruno could properly come to as he looked upon the faces of the deceased who had been taken hostage by the local militants and killed during the assault to bring them to justice. Among them was a young girl, no older than 10, whose lifeless eyes conveyed the fear and anguish she must have felt right before her life was snuffed away, most likely not by the devils who had held her by gunpoint, but the men who had come to save her. Eric was a man like Bruno who cared more about completing the objective than the collateral damage that came in the way. And shooting through a hostage to kill the target was certainly an efficient means of ensuring the militants did not escape. But even Bruno would have a hard time justifying pulling the trigger when that hostage was a child, something Eric didn't seem remotely concerned about. It was true Bruno did not know the full story. He wasn't on the team of stormtroopers sent to eliminate the religious fanatics. However, he also knew Eric's personality well enough, as well as the sadistic murderers and psychopaths beneath his command who called themselves soldiers. This blood was not necessarily on Bruno's hands. He had not given the order to attack the militants as they tried to negotiate with the surrounding gendarme forces. He was still on a train to Sarajevo and only arrived after the chaos had been more or less settled. Even so, Bruno was the one who kept Eric on a leash when the man was little more than a rabid dog in need of being put down. As Bruno exhaled the smoke from his lungs, the rain began to fall upon the corpses of the victims and the perpetrators. All the while, the medics began to carry them off one by one in body bags. Seemingly noticing the general simply standing there smoking as he gazed upon the aftermath of this most recent act of religious and ethnic violence committed in the Balkans, the medic approached Bruno. His uniform was very clearly Austro-Hungarian, as were the distinctions to rank and unit on it. The medic's German was far from fluent, but he spoke enough to make sense to Bruno. "Did you know her? The victim, I mean?" Bruno shook his head as he flicked his cigarette butt onto the ground, where he stamped it out beneath the sole of his boot. He only responded after beginning to walk away. His words were far more grim than the medic was expecting from the man. "Not in the slightest. I'm just beginning to wonder if this is all worth a pitiful attempt to save a dying empire." After saying this, Bruno wandered off in the rain to go meet up with the other generals whose forces were spread across Bosnia, Serbia, and Montenegro, trying their best to maintain law and order as the preparations needed to begin an invasion of the Ottoman Empire continued in the background. The building temporarily acting as the Balkan Theater's operational command room was filled with the smell of smoke and booze, as the leadership of the imperial forces had long since stopped celebrating and instead found themselves in a state of despair. Bruno reached for the nearest bottle of vodka which the Russians had brought over from the motherland and poured himself a glass without even asking for permission. After doing so, he drank the entire thing in one go, before pouring himself another to sip on while he made a major announcement to the other generals currently acting beneath his command. I have decided to launch an expedition into Albania. So long as the lawlessness there can be taken advantage of by Bulgaria and the Ottomans in a short-sighted and ill-conceived proxy war, the borders of Austro-Hungary will suffer. Law and order must return to Albania if we wish to stabilize things here in our own territory. And since we have a few months at the latest before the preparations are concluded for our invasion of the Ottoman Empire, then I see no reason why we should sit here and wait for the next attack by fanatics of every denomination. If anyone else has any concerns regarding this punitive expedition, speak now or forever hold your peace. Bruno may have complete operational authority over all imperial forces within the Balkans, but that did not mean that he ruled with an iron fist like some kind of dictator. These men were generals every bit as much as he was, meaning that they had long stories of military careers full of experience and knowledge he could very well make use of. After all, Bruno's rise to the top had been over the course of roughly 15 years, which was still a very short amount of time by the normal standards. Invading Albania could be conceived as a necessary action. The nation existed on the coastline, and while technically neutral, was in a state of total anarchy at the moment, meaning that the Allied powers could easily slip operatives, both of the military and intelligence variety, into the country before sending them into Austro-Hungarian territory. In fact, Bruno suspected that was a large cause for these ongoing conflicts between ethnic and religious paramilitary groups. Normally, a formal declaration of war would be needed to invade the small Balkan principality, but they were currently leaderless, as the prince had fled the country at the start of the war, and no form of provisional government had taken over during his absence. Thus, the only real justification Bruno needed to send troops into the area was having some form of evidence connecting the militant groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and Kosovo to those in Albania. There was just one problem. They did not have this evidence just yet. And because of this, the leader of the Austro-Hungarian forces in the Balkans was quick to comment on this fact. I would agree with an invasion into Albania. However, we don't have just cause to invade, as we have yet to find any evidence linking the militants in our territory to those in Albania. At least not in any direct way that could justify such an expedition in accordance with international law. After hearing this, Bruno did not appear the least bit dismayed. Instead, he finished his second glass of vodka before patting the Austro-Hungarian general on the shoulder, assuring him the man would have his evidence soon enough. Give me a fortnight, and I will collect the evidence required to justify an expedition into the Principality of Albania. If that is the only concern that any of you have, then I am going to go do that right this very instant. Stay safe, gentlemen. We live in uncertain times, and it is unknown whether or not these militants will begin targeting us rather than simply each other. Bruno would naturally take every precaution necessary to safeguard himself, the other generals, and pretty much everyone else in the region of importance both to him personally, as well as to the interests of the imperial powers and their ongoing military efforts. As for coming up with the evidence to link the militants in Austro-Hungarian territory to those in Albania, Bruno would need to make a call for that. And because of this, he would chat with his beloved wife much sooner than he had anticipated after his very brief reunion with his family.